Chapter 948. The 12 Heavenly Temples was probably the most memorable abandoned dungeon in Tomono Kakaze's memory. The so-called abandoned instance dungeons were those that had already been designed and completed, but in the end, they were abandoned by the developers. There were many such abandoned dungeons in Sword Maiden Online. It was said that 108 dungeons were designed and created when the game was first launched. However, only 98 of them were used while the remaining 10 were abandoned. Apart from that, the game would add a new dungeon every year. Of course, these dungeons were created after thorough discussions and confirmed that there were no problems. However, there were always some special circumstances that happened in the past 200 years. As a result, these dungeons had to be abandoned after they were completed and would never appear in front of the players again. There were many reasons for this. Some of them were because the dungeon's story was found to be inconsistent with reality and was forced to be abandoned. Some of them were because the plot of the dungeon caused dissatisfaction with the family members of the characters involved in the dungeon and was forced to be abandoned. There were also problems with the difficulty of the dungeon that made it difficult for the players to complete the dungeon and was forced to be abandoned. However, the most common reason was that the dungeon could not pass the review of the Sword Committee after it was created. The 12 Heavenly Palaces was such an instance dungeon. In fact, the 12 Heavenly Palaces was one of the oldest instance dungeons in Sword Maiden Online. It was one of the 10 instance dungeons that were abandoned when Sword Maiden Online was first launched. It was said that some beta players were lucky enough to play this instance dungeon. In the game's official website, there was also information about the 12 Heavenly Palaces. However, when the game started its open beta, the dungeon was completely removed. Later on, there was some news that the dungeon did not pass the review of the Sword Committee. As for the reason, no one could figure it out because the Sword Committee was too lazy to explain such things. Therefore, when Tomono Kakaze heard that Guhan had unlocked the 12 Heavenly Temples dungeon, her childish face instantly turned sour. She did not even bother to say another word to Guhan. She closed her eyes and began to search for the dungeon. The search went on for a full hour. Finally, he opened his eyes helplessly and said to Guhan, "Don't enter this dungeon for now. I have to report this dungeon to the Research Institute and let them deal with this problem. I suspect that it's very likely that the Research Institute will directly close this dungeon from the back end. If you're in the dungeon at that time, it'll become very troublesome. Your consciousness may even be trapped in this dungeon forever. So, before I give you accurate information, you are absolutely not allowed to enter this dungeon." Could this dungeon be a backup plan left behind by the Heaven-Shrouding Sword Emperor? Based on his previous encounter, Ji Yuhan instinctively guessed that this was also something left behind by the Heaven-Shrouding Sword Emperor. Impossible. This isn't some minor modification of the dungeon's data. It directly created a new dungeon on top of your sub-dungeon tree. This requires a very high level of authority. Even I don't have that kind of authority. The backup plan that Zhe Tianjendi left behind would definitely not be able to do this. After saying that, Tomono Kakaze hurriedly disappeared from Guhan's sight. She was probably going to report the situation to the Research Institute. With Tomono Kakaze's warning, Guhan did not dare to enter the 12 Heavenly Temples dungeon again. Instead, he immediately logged out of the game and began to search for information related to the 12 Heavenly Temples in the History Forum. In fact, Guhan had a slight understanding of the 12 Heavenly Temples. The so-called 12 Heavenly Temples was actually a test that Kunzu had left behind for the future generations. It was said that when Kunzu was 50 years old, he suddenly felt that he was getting old. At the same time, his biological son was only 2 or 3 years old. If anything happened to him, his abilities might not be able to continue. Therefore, Kunzu announced to all humans that he would build 12 palaces on a mountain outside of New Yangjing City called the Skyscraper Cliff. These 12 palaces would be set up with different tests. Sword bearers below the level of an immortal sword would not participate in this test. If anyone could successfully pass all the tests of the 12 palaces, they would be able to become Kunzu's disciple and become Kunzu's personal disciple. Becoming the personal disciple of the most powerful Kunzu in the world was naturally the dream of countless people. In a short period of 7 or 8 years, tens of thousands of people participated in the 12 heavenly temples test. However, among these tens of thousands of people, not a single one of them had passed all 12 palaces. Later on, Kunzu actually took back the 12 heavenly temples and announced to the public that he would not accept any more disciples. This matter, which had caused all the sword bearers to flock to, slowly died down and gradually became a small story in street literature. Perhaps many people in this world knew the name of the 12 heavenly temples. However, very few people knew what the tests of the 12 heavenly temples were. After exiting the game, Ji Yuhan flipped through the books for a full 4 hours. However, all of the information was about the story of the 12 skyscraping palaces. There wasn't a single written record of the trials of the 12 skyscraping palaces. At that time, tens of thousands of people had participated in the 12 heavenly temples test. Among these tens of thousands of people, there should have been at least a few thousand people who had recorded the stories. This was something that could not be hidden. At the same time, this had happened after the apocalypse. Therefore, it could not have been included in the list of destruction after the cultural apocalypse. Therefore, it was clear that the information about the 12 heavenly temples had been deliberately blocked by the Sword Committee. However, this did not matter. The Sword Committee's blockade was not difficult for Guhan. In the past, Guhan had a hacker friend that he could borrow. Now, for Guhan, this was just a matter of communication. Therefore, Guhan immediately called Lu Shihua. After a few seconds, Lu Shihua's voice, which he had not heard for a long time, rang in Guhan's ears. "Teacher." As soon as he heard Lu Shihua's voice, Guhan acutely felt that something was wrong. Lu Shihua's personality was very calm, like a reliable big sister. However, Lu Shihua's voice was very melodious, like a yellow oriole. At this moment, Lu Shihua's voice was very low. Clearly, this was not a change in the vocal cords, but a change in Lu Shihua's mood. Lu Shihua seemed to be in a very low mood, so even his voice was low. "Shihua? What happened in Yuzhang City?" Guhan asked in surprise. "Grand Great Master. Grand Great Master, he." Lu Shihua's voice was intermittent, and his voice was filled with a sobbing tone. Coupled with the mention of the words Grand Great Master, no matter how stupid Ji Yuhan was, he still reacted. It was likely that his cheap master Liu Lei had encountered a huge problem. "Don't cry. You are the Sword Pavilion Master. You must not cry." Guhan used a firm voice to help Lu Shihua stabilize his emotions. Then, he calmly guided him. "Tell me, how is my teacher now? Could it be that he—" "No. Grandmaster is still alive, but Grandmaster, he—" Lu Shihua choked for a long time. "But Grandmaster can't make it. The doctor said that Grandmaster can only hold on for a few more days at most. He's going to, how could this be? Before I left, teacher told me that he could hold on for another year or two." Guhan's voice instantly grew louder. It was clear that Guhan, who had just been helping Lu Shihua stabilize his emotions, had become a little unstable himself. However, when Lu Shihua heard that his master was about to explode, he calmed down and began to comfort his master softly. "Yesterday, 2 U-class Yuan Ku appeared in our Yuzhang city's safe zone. They surrounded 2 spirit sword rank swordsmen, dozens of famed sword rank swordsmen, and hundreds of ancient sword rank swordsmen. Ancestral Grandpa immediately rushed over to help. Although he succeeded in rescuing the trapped sword bearers, he was unable to do so. However, Ancestral Master was also injured by 2 universe-level Yuan Ku when he was fighting with Yuan Ku. After returning, Ancestral Grandpa continuously coughed up blood for the entire night. In the morning, the doctor said that Ancestral Grandpa's purple palace had already dried up. It was just that Ancestral Grandpa had been forcefully holding on until now. However, the battle yesterday completely injured Ancestral Grandpa's purple palace. The sword marks in his purple palace have already begun to disperse. At most, in 2 or 3 days, all the sword marks will disappear. Lu Shihua couldn't continue speaking. However, Guhan now completely understood Liu Lei's situation. The sword marks in a sword-bearer's purple palace would disappear due to many reasons. For example, self-diagnosis, or if it was forcefully dispersed by Yuan Ku. However, These situations weren't enough to kill the swordbearer. At most, the swordbearer would become an ordinary person, and their life wouldn't be affected. However, once the sword marks of the swordbearer began to disperse, it meant that the swordbearer had reached the end of his lifespan. The swordbearer was about to die of old age. With the development of modern medicine, there were no diseases that modern medicine couldn't cure. Only the natural death of old age due to the end of one's lifespan was something that modern medicine couldn't cure no matter what. When an ordinary person died of old age, they would just close their eyes and collapse their legs. There wouldn't be any signs before this. However, the death of a swordbearer was different. Before the swordbearer died of old age, the sword marks in his purple palace would involuntarily and uncontrollably disperse. At the same time, all of the swordbearers would enter a state of deep sleep. When the sword marks in the purple palace completely dispersed, the swordbearer would die along with the swordbearer. The swordbearers would also completely lose their bond with the swordbearer and return to the sword pavilion to wait for their next swordbearer. It was obvious that Liu Lei had entered this state. Just like what the doctor said, in at most 2 or 3 days, Liu Lei would leave this world forever. Chapter 949. Shihua, where are you now? Are you by Master's side? After a long silence, Guhan finally spoke. I'm not. Lu Shihua replied in a small voice. What? Are you still my, Guhan's, disciple? Are you Master's disciple? Why aren't you by Master's side at such an important moment? Where are you now? Guhan's voice was filled with anger. At that moment, Guhan felt extremely guilty. Because he was in Shanhai Pass, Guhan couldn't return to Liu Lei's side. Lu Shihua, his disciple, naturally became Guhan's hope. Guhan hoped that when he wasn't by Liu Lei's side, his disciple could take his place and stay by his master's side. It's not that I don't want to be by Grandmaster's side, it's just that some people. Lu Shihua didn't continue, but Guhan could guess what Lu Shihua wanted to say. Yuzhang City's emperor sword aristocratic families saw that Liu Lei was about to die and that Lu Shihua was only an ancient sword wielder. Therefore, they started to trip Lu Shihua up. They used all sorts of methods to stop Lu Shihua from entering the ward, not giving Lu Shihua a chance to see Liu Lei. Shihua, take your sword, lady, and rush into the hospital. If anyone dares to stop you, use your status as Sword Pavilion Master to ban them from entering Sword Pavilion for the rest of their lives. I want to see who dares to play around with their future, Guhan said to Lu Shihua. But Master, will this? Lu Shihua was still worried. It's not like it will or won't. This is a critical time. If you don't show some of the spirit of a Sword Pavilion Master, they will think that you are a pushover. Who knows how they will bully you in the future? Then there are some seniors. They are blocking the door of my martial ancestor's ward. Lu Shihua said awkwardly again. The seniors she was referring to were naturally the elders from the Emperor Sword family who had stopped Guhan from making the decision to become the Sword Pavilion Master. I have my ways to deal with those people. Listen to me. After Guhan explained how to deal with those old men, he hesitated for a moment before continuing. By the way, after this is over, don't always stay in Yuzhang City. Go out to accept more tasks and accumulate sword essence. Strength is the way to go. The sooner you become Jendi, the sooner these people will kneel at your feet, understand? Yes, Master. Lu Shihua nodded. Then, she followed Guhan's instructions and rushed into the hospital where Liu Lei was. At the entrance of the hospital stood a row of sword-wielding men. These sword-wielding men did not say anything when they saw Lu Shihua appear. They just stood in front of Lu Shihua and formed a human wall. These sword-wielding men were all artifact sword-level sword-wielding men. It was a piece of cake for them to work together to block an ancient sword-level sword wielder. The few of you listen up. I will count to 3. If any of you don't move aside, I guarantee that you will never be able to enter the sword pavilion ever again, Lu Shihua said coldly. The sword-wielding men in front of her were stunned when they heard this. After looking at each other for a while, one of the sword-wielding men suddenly bent down to tie his shoelaces. Lu Shihua took this opportunity to jump into the hospital. The rest of the artifact sword-level sword-wielding men no longer dared to block Lu Shihua. Family head. It seems that the little fellows below you are not brave enough. They actually couldn't block a little kid. Beside the family head, Potian, who had once opposed Guhan, an old man of similar status laughed and said, "Me. Didn't those fellows in your family also move aside?" The family head glanced at the old man, and then calmly said, "The little fellows still need to improve, so it's reasonable that they are not infected. However, us old fellows have to show our true colors. This old man is only like this for the rest of my life. Do you still expect me to become a spirit sword level sword wielder?" The other old man smiled and didn't say anything. Potian was indeed right. These old fellows had been stuck in the position of famous sword level sword wielding for most of their lives. They had already accumulated more than hundreds of thousands of quarks of sword element. They had tested all the sword ladies of spirit sword level, but they still couldn't find a sword lady that could synchronize with them. Obviously, they would only be famous sword level sword wielding men for the rest of their lives. There was no possibility for them to go further. In this way, they would not have any desire for the sword pavilion. They would not be afraid of Lu Shihua's threat. Seniors. Lu Shihua walked to the front of these family heads and respectfully bowed. Through Lu Shihua's red and swollen eyelids, as well as the tear stains that were still imprinted on his face, even a fool could see that Lu Shihua had cried a lot just now. "Can you let Grand Disciple go in and say a few words to Grand Master?" Unfortunately, these family heads were all people with hearts of stone. How could their hearts soften because of a few drops of tears from Lu Shihua? Potian, who had already fallen out with Guhan, simply put on a sour face and looked at Lu Shihua. "You're not allowed to go in. Chairman didn't say that he wanted to see you, so you're not qualified to go in. Seniors, please be magnanimous. This time, Shihua owes you a favor. Please rest assured and slide in." Lu Shihua bowed again and said. However, these family heads still did not have any reaction, as if Lu Shihua did not exist. "Everyone, please make way." This was a voice that was completely different from Lu Shihua's voice. This voice sounded very hollow, as if it was an illusory voice that came from the void. Potian and the others couldn't help but raise their heads, and saw an angel holding a long sword in his hand and a pair of white wings on his back looking at them. "Not good." Yuan Ku broke in, an old man screamed. He instinctively thought that this angel was a Yuan Ku. Then, he instantly summoned his sword Maiden and prepared to attack this angel. "Wait." Potian hurriedly stopped this old man, because at this time, Potian had already discovered that this angel in front of him was not a Yuan Ku, but a genuine sword maiden. "You go in." Potian suddenly sighed, then moved his body to the side, giving way to the door to enter the ward. "Old man Shu, what are you doing?" The old man next to him asked in confusion, but Potian directly gave him a warning look. The old man didn't say anything else and shut his mouth. "Thank you, seniors." Lu Shihua bowed for the third time, then prepared to enter the ward with this angel. Lu Shihua, right. Potian suddenly said in a deep voice, "Everything that we have done before is our fault. I hope that we can stop here, and from now on, our previous grievances will be written off. What do you think?" Lu Shihua stood in place for a long time before replying word by word. "It's not whether Shihua is willing to write it off with all of you, but whether Shihua's master is willing to write it off with all of you. I am very sorry, but I cannot give you an answer." After saying this, Lu Shihua directly entered the ward, and then with a bang, closed the door. "Old man Shu, what is going on with you? Why did your tone suddenly change?" Seeing Lu Shihua enter the ward, the old man immediately asked with dissatisfaction. "Old man, where have you been for the past few decades? Do you still not recognize the sword mistress with a pair of wings on her back?" Potian scolded, then left the hospital without looking back. Could it be that it is the double-winged angel sword? The old man finally reacted, and his face instantly looked like a crying cucumber. As long as the sword mistress with the double-winged angel sword did not die, she would be destined to become an emperor sword mistress. In other words, from this moment onwards, he and his family had already offended a future Gendi. Only God knew how this Lu Shihua would take revenge on him when he grew up. Damn, this little bastard is really cunning. It has been a few months, and yet he has hidden his sword mistress so well. Otherwise, who would have the time to provoke her? The old man said, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Grandmaster, Grandpa, I am unfilial to only come to see you now. Once he entered the ward, Liu Shihua kneeled in front of Liu Lei's bed, and said in a tearful voice, "Good child. You must have put in a lot of effort to come in." Liu Lei slowly turned his head, looked at the grand disciple kneeling in front of him, and spoke in an extremely weak yet gentle voice. At this time, Liu Lei was still conscious, but his body was as stiff as a puppet. Even the simple action of turning his head required Liu Lei to expend a lot of energy to do it. "No, I only showed my double-winged angel sword, and no one dared to stop me," Liu Shihua quickly said. "You silly child. How could you do such a stupid thing?" When Liu Lei heard this, he suddenly became a little emotional. "I have already warned you again and again, before you become a spiritual sword mistress, you must absolutely not reveal your sword mistress. Otherwise, those people who have a grudge against you will definitely think of ways to strangle you, the future Jendi, in the cradle. No, Master said that a sea swallow that does not experience wind and rain will never be able to fly. If I can't even withstand this little test, then no matter how talented I am, I will never be able to become an emperor sword mistress in this lifetime." Liu Shihua told him everything that Guhan had told him. "Your master is also a worrisome fellow." Liu Lei let out a long sigh. "Send me your communicator. I think Guhan must be anxiously waiting." Guhan was indeed anxiously waiting. From the moment he picked up Liu Shihua's communicator, he had not hung up. At this time, he had been in contact for more than an hour. "Master, your disciple is unfilial. I can't personally serve by Master's side." This was the first thing that Guhan said to Liu Lei. "It's okay. Your matter is even more important. I've already heard that you've successfully saved the Shanghai Pass from the crisis, and you've even saved the Saintess of Jerusalem. Although others don't know that it's all because of you, I know better than anyone how important my precious disciple is. You're the greatest pride of my life, and I'm proud of you. You're the greatest glory of my life. Master." On the other end of the communicator, Guhan suddenly burst into tears. This was the second time that Guhan had cried since his parents passed away. Liu Lei was the second person in this world that Guhan had felt the warmth of a father. But now, this person was leaving him forever. "Don't cry. Master's life is enough. You should send Master off with a smile." Liu Lei's voice was getting weaker and weaker. If Guhan could see Liu Lei's purple palace at this time, he would definitely find that the sword mark in Liu Lei's purple palace had already disappeared. This speed of disappearing was much faster than the doctor had estimated, and Liu Lei could not hold on for more than a few minutes. "Master doesn't have anything good left for you. But Master only has one sentence. I hope you will always remember it," Liu Lei said with difficulty. "Disciple, please tell me." On the other end of the communicator, Qingpin, who had just woken up on the bed, was surprised because she found that her Guhan was kneeling on the ground, and his eyes were swollen like walnuts, and his face was covered with countless tear stains. "Crying devil, shame on your face. Guhan, shame on your face." Qingpin stuck out her tongue at him. "Disciple, you must remember, as an emperor, you must protect the country and the people, that's all." As soon as the voice fell, the sword mark in Liu Lei's purple palace disappeared without a trace. This legendary old man had been protected by Yuzhong City for half his life, and he had also protected Yuzhong City for half his life. The great sword immortal of the Nine Heavens passed away on March 7, 3009 at the age of 91. Chapter 950. That night, Guhan received a report from the Sword Committee Association to the 8 base cities and Shanhaiguan. The protector of Yuzhong City, the leader of the swordbearers, and the chairman of the Yuzhong Sword Committee, Cloudy Sword Immortal Liu Lei, had passed away due to his severe injuries. To express their condolences to Liu Lei, the Sword Committee Association announced at the same time. The 8 base cities collectively mourned for 3 days. Flags would be flown at half-mast for 3 days, all activities would be stopped for 3 days, and no red, yellow, or purple colors were allowed for 3 days. These were the honors that Sword Immortal level swordbearers had after their deaths. Every time a human sword immortal level swordbearer passed away, the 8 base cities would have the same event. Just like a few months ago, after sword immortal Tian Hen of Yangjing City had died in battle against the run-level Yuan bandit, the humans had also held a similar mourning event. This was not a rare occurrence. However, in reality, something very strange had happened to Liu Lei's death. Sword Maiden Online announced on its official website that to express its condolences to Liu Lei, the entire Sword Maiden Online would shut down its servers for 3 days starting from midnight the next day. This was something that rarely happened in the history of Sword Maiden Online. Because it was claimed that there would never be a bug, Sword Maiden Online had never shut down its servers for system maintenance. Sword Maiden Online servers would only be shut down for 10 days when an Emperor Sword Immortal level swordbearer passed away to express its condolences to Jendi. However, this was only out of respect for Jendi. Sword Maiden Online had never shut down its servers for 3 days for any Sword Immortal level swordbearer. This was the first time in history that something like this had happened, and it made all the players very curious. At the same time, they wanted to find out what kind of earth-shattering things Liu Lei had done, so much so that Sword Maiden Online would shut down its servers for 3 days for the first time. Although Sword Immortal level swordbearers were the absolute higher-ups among humans, at least 60% of humans did not know who Liu Lei was. About 80% of them only knew that Liu Lei was the chairman of Yuzhang City's sword committee, but they knew nothing about Liu Lei's achievements. Even the common people of Yuzhang City didn't know about these things. It was a very normal thing. Just like before the Great Calamity, many people in Huaxia might have known who the president of Huaxia was, but how many people knew who was on the 7-member standing committee of the highest authority in Huaxia? Therefore, after looking it up, these humans found out about Liu Lei's great past. They knew about Liu Lei's bloody battle at Jiayu Gate, sending orphans thousands of miles away, and fighting against the 4 universe-level masters, Yuan Ku, and so on. This allowed many people who knew nothing about Liu Lei to understand him. At the same time, they were filled with respect for him. Many people even lit candles to send Liu Lei off. Liu Lei's fame among the humans increased by several folds. These were things that Liu Lei couldn't do when he was alive, but he did it after he died because of a small game. Even though this was something worth celebrating, it was still so sad to think about it. Ordinary people might really think that Sword Maiden Online was just to mourn, but in fact, Guhan knew better than anyone else. How could Sword Maiden Online break the convention and stop the server for a sword wielder of immortal sword tier? Obviously, this was just an excuse. The real reason was that there was a bug in Sword Maiden Online that could only be resolved by stopping the server. This bug was probably the 12 skyscraping temples dungeon that he had triggered. Since he had to stop the server for 3 days, there was no need for Guhan to hide in the Guardian's mansion anymore. For the first time in 3 months, Guhan took the initiative to leave the Shising garrison. He circled around his own T-star garrison and secretly observed the 18 ancient sword wielder that belonged to him. He couldn't help but frown. Some of these ancient sword wielder were sleeping, some were surfing the internet, and some were playing football in 2 teams. In fact, this wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It was completely normal entertainment, but it was this normal entertainment that was unforgivable in the eyes of the depressed Guhan. So, Guhan used his authority as the guardian to gather all the ancient sword wielder in front of him. "Where are the white flowers on you?" Seeing these ancient sword rank swordbearers gathered together, Ji Yuhan asked with a harsh and cruel expression. These ancient sword rank swordbearers could not help but shudder. All right, let's go. Let's go. Who has nothing better to do than to wear white flowers? A few ancient sword wielder subconsciously said what was on their minds, but they immediately covered their mouths with their palms. Because at this time, these ancient sword wielder realized that Guhan was wearing a white robe. He had a white ribbon tied around his head, white rings around his wrists, and a white paper flower on his chest. This was not how a normal person would dress. No matter how they looked at it, it looked like their boss was wearing mourning clothes. Today, a great sword wielder passed away. Have you all forgotten the customs of the sword wielder? There was a custom among the sword wielder. When an immortal sword wielder passed away, All the sword wielder had to wear a white flower on their chest for 3 days as a sign of mourning. But this was only a custom, not a rule. Therefore, most of the sword bearers of Yuzhong City would wear this white flower, but the sword bearers of other cities would not be so lucky. He had not received any benefits from Yuzhong City, so why should he wear a white flower for the sword bearers of Yuzhong City who were at the immortal sword tier? When they reached a place like Shanhai Pass, there were even fewer people who would follow this custom. After all, this was a precarious place. If they were not careful, they might die here the next day. They might wear white flowers for others, but who would wear white flowers for themselves? So the sword wielder in Shanhai Pass was probably the most disdainful of this custom. In the entire Shanhai Pass, there were probably no more than 100 sword wielder who wore white flowers for Liu Lei. Hearing Guhan's question, these ancient sword wielder finally understood why their boss was so angry. But they didn't care. If you wanted to be filial, that was your business. What did it have to do with them? The emotions in their hearts were reflected on their faces, and these sword wielders' expressions were more or less filled with disdain. You can't be taught. Guhan's long sword pointed angrily at the ground, and then hundreds of thousands of sword auras burst out from the feet of these ancient sword wielder. They shot up into the sky like a geyser, and then landed on the ground and exploded into a cloud of smoke. These ancient sword wielder were scared out of their wits. If they had not controlled the sword auras well, they would have lost an arm or a leg. Our boss is definitely a madman. I definitely don't want to work under this madman. These ancient sword wielder all had the same thought. They wanted to immediately go to Baihu Guardian's mansion and use their contribution points to apply for a change of position. But on the surface, none of them dared to show such thoughts. They could only stand in front of Guhan even more respectfully, looking like obedient children. Sorry. Did I scare you guys? Guhan suddenly sighed and then said to these ancient sword wielder who were scared out of their wits, Sword Immortal Cloudy Sky is my master, so I can't help but be a little emotional. So that's how it is. So our boss is the disciple of an immortal sword wielder. The sword wielder came to a sudden realization, and at the same time, a little bit of respect for Guhan emerged in their hearts. To be able to grieve so much for his master, it seemed that their boss was a righteous and compassionate person. But soon, these ancient sword wielder expressed that they had to take back their words. This was because not only was Guhan a righteous and compassionate person, he was also a demon who liked to torture people. This was because Guhan told them that in order to express their condolences for Sword Immortal Cloudy Sky, he hoped that everyone present would draw a picture to express their grief for Sword Immortal Cloudy Sky. Hearing the word draw, these sword wielder were already screaming in their hearts. These people were old and young, and they were very good at fighting. But when had they ever drawn a picture? In their entire lives, they had never even picked up a brush. Forget it. I'll just make a few random mistakes and be done with it, these ancient sword wielder thought to themselves. These ancient sword wielders thought to themselves. Then, just as they were about to scribble something on paper, Ji Yuhan suddenly pulled out a cigarette. Ji Yuchen. Ji Yuhan pulled out a yellow-haired ancient sword wielder who was standing at the very front of the group. This was the youngest of the ancient sword wielder, only 19 years old. But even though he was only 19, he was still half a year older than Ji Yuhan. I walked around just now and found you hiding in the bushes smoking. I think you must be a good smoker, Guhan said with a smile. Haha, what's wrong, boss? The rules don't say that I can't smoke, Ji Yuchen said with a bitter expression. He thought that Guhan was looking for an excuse to teach him a lesson. I didn't say that you smoked too much. Guhan directly stuffed the cigarette into Ji Yuchen's mouth. Then, with a flash of the juicy sword in his hand, the cigarette was instantly lit. Who? Ji Yuchen couldn't help but take a deep breath, letting the thick smell of tobacco fill his throat and lungs. He exhaled through his nose, and his nerves were instantly filled with satisfaction. It was as if he had just had a good time. Boss, your cigarette is too good. Where did you buy it? I'll go buy a pack and smoke too. Ji Yuchen seemed to have forgotten how scary Guhan was in front of him. He wanted to get close to Guhan, wanting to know where he could buy the cigarettes. Unfortunately, He didn't know that the cigarettes were specially supplied by the chairman of the Yuzhang Sword Pavilion. Liu Lei didn't smoke, so he gave all the cigarettes he had accumulated over the past few decades to Gu Han. Gu Han naturally didn't smoke either, so it meant that the cigarettes were given to the brat Jiu Yuchen for free. "Don't worry. I guarantee that you'll hate the smell very soon," Gu Han said with a smile. "No way. That's impossible. I can't get enough of this thing in my life. How could I hate it?" Jiu Yuchen said happily, not taking Gu Han's words seriously. "That's good. Now take another puff and exhale it." Although Jiu Yuchen didn't know why Gu Han wanted him to do this, smoking wasn't a painful thing. Therefore, Jiu Yuchen obediently followed Gu Han's words. When the smoke came out of Jiu Yuchen's nose, Gu Han suddenly pulled out his sword and aimed at Jiu Yuchen's face like a kaleidoscope. The sword light was so close to Jiu Yuchen's face that Jiu Yuchen felt that Gu Han's sword was dancing on the tip of his nose. He was so scared that his legs went soft, and he knelt on the ground on the spot. "Learn the sword technique I used just now and draw this painting." Hearing Gu Han's words, Jiu Yuchen, who was sweating profusely, raised his head in confusion. He saw that the smoke that came out of his nose had turned into an ink portrait of a person floating in the air. The portrait of this person was naturally the deceased cloudy sword immortal, Liu Lei. Chapter 951. These were probably the most painful 3 days that these ancient sword rank swordbearers had ever experienced. During these 3 days, these ancient sword rank swordbearers were forced by Gu Han to practice the 9 firmament sword technique. Of course, this was just the name that Gu Han had given to this sword technique. The ancient sword rank swordbearers secretly called this sword technique the rune ghost sword technique. According to the requirements of the freezing cold, these swordbearers had to use their swords to draw a portrait of Liu Lei before the smoke dissipated. Even if these swordbearers were given a piece of paper and a brush, without 10 days of hard work, these swordbearers would not be able to draw Liu Lei's appearance, let alone make a portrait of some smoke drifting in the wind. However, Gu Han did not give up until he achieved his goal. He had even sealed off the entire garrison residence. Without Gu Han's permission, these ancient sword rank swordbearers would not be able to leave the Shising garrison. Helpless, these unlucky swordbearers could only draw at the smoke over and over again. At the same time, they imagined Liu Lei's face in their minds. Even if they added up the amount of time they had missed their parents, they would not have missed Liu Lei more. However, Gu Han did not just let them try it out on their own. In fact, in these 3 days, Gu Han had subtly become the teacher of these 17 ancient sword rank swordbearers. Gu Han would personally teach these ancient sword rank swordbearers how to hold the sword, how to draw the sword, and various other sword techniques. After 3 days, although these ancient sword rank swordbearers could not draw a portrait of Liu Lei as realistically as Gu Han, they had no problem drawing a portrait of a person's head. Some of the more talented swordbearers could even draw a nose and eyes. This meant that their swordsmanship had reached a whole new level. If there was anyone who was worse off than these ancient sword rank swordbearers, it was probably Jiu Yuchen. This was because Jiu Yuchen was the person that Gu Han had personally chosen not to draw. However, he had a more important task, which was to be responsible for the smoke that the other 17 swordbearers needed to draw with. In these 3 days, Jiu Yuchen did not do anything else but chain smoke continuously. He would then blow out the smoke and use it as a drawing board for the other ancient sword rank swordbearers. At the beginning, Jiu Yuchen was quite happy. To be able to continuously smoke such delicious cigarettes was a wonderful thing. However, Jiu Yuchen soon discovered that this was not a wonderful thing at all. The cigarette smell that Jiu Yuchen loved so much now tasted like bitter gourd. At the same time, Jiu Yuchen's throat began to itch, and his lungs felt uncomfortable. His entire body felt like it was covered in smoke. In just half a day, Jiu Yuchen found Gu Han and begged for mercy. He said that he would rather practice painting than smoke. Unfortunately, Gu Han did not care about Jiu Yuchen's request. Under Gu Han's coercion, Jiu Yuchen was responsible for supplying all the smoke for the next 3 days. This was probably the worst day of Jiu Yuchen's life. Jiu Yuchen had never felt that the smell of cigarettes was so horrible and disgusting. Gu Yuchen swore to the heavens that he would never touch a cigarette again. It was not until the third day that Gu Yuchen fainted from nicotine poisoning that he was temporarily relieved. As for Gu Yuchen fainting from nicotine poisoning, Guhan did not care. As long as there was a medical pod, after a few hours Gu Ying would be like a good man again. His lungs would be as clean as a newborn baby's, and not even a trace of nicotine would be left behind. There was basically no psychological threat. However, Guhan probably felt that he had tortured Gu Yuchen enough. Since the other party probably did not want to smoke for the rest of his life, Guhan let the two love robots, Ohm and Electromew, replace Gu Yuchen. After all, they were love robots. Even if they smoked for the rest of their lives, they would not refuse or slack off. On the third day, Ji Yuhan's anger at Liu Lei's death was completely extinguished by these unlucky ancient sword-grade swordbearers. Logically speaking, Guhan should have let these unlucky bastards go, but in reality, these 3 days of teaching had made Guhan think about many things. First of all, Guhan did not force these ancient sword-wielders to draw just because he wanted to torture them. In reality, this was a kind of compensation in Guhan's heart. Guhan felt that he had done too little for Liu Lei, and that he was not a good disciple, so he always wanted to do something to make it up to Liu Lei. That was why Ji Yuhan had chosen to teach these ancient sword-rank swordbearers how to draw Liu Lei's portrait. Not only was it a way to commemorate Liu Lei, but it was also because he wanted to teach his disciples in Liu Lei's stead. He had also lied about the fact that Liu Lei had created the 9-firmament cloud sword, so that these ancient sword-rank swordbearers could pass down their master's sword technique. However, in the actual teaching process, Guhan vaguely had other thoughts. Therefore, when the 3 days were up and the nationwide mourning was over, Sword Maiden Online was released as scheduled, it was time for Guhan to enter the game again. Ji Yuhan did not let these ancient sword-rank sword-wielders go. Instead, he pulled out the meticulous Juzi sword and ordered it to be the supervisor of these ancient sword-rank sword-wielders. It was to supervise them as they continued to draw. Considering that Juzi sword was a little slow, and might be tricked by some crafty people, Ji Yuhan decided to leave Po Qing and Yi Tian behind as well. With these two crafty people supervising them, this training session would definitely go smoothly. After returning to the game, the first thing Guhan did was open his dungeon tree to see if the 12 skyscraping temples dungeon was still there. The result surprised Guhan. According to Guhan's guess, the 12 skyscraping temples dungeon was definitely going to be removed as a bug. After all, Sword Maiden Online had been shut down for 3 days because of this bug. From this, it could be seen how bad the impact of this bug on Sword Maiden Online was. It was like a pest in the game, it had to be removed. However, when Guhan opened his dungeon tree, he was surprised to find that the 12 skyscraping temples dungeon was still there. This meant that the 12 skyscraping temples dungeon had not been removed. Therefore, the surprised Guhan immediately contacted Tomono Kakaze. Not long after, the little girl appeared in front of Guhan. Although Tomono Sasuke's still looked full of energy, Ji Yuhan could still see some fatigue in her expression. As an artificial intelligence, let alone 3 days of work, even if this artificial intelligence worked continuously for 300 years, she would not feel tired at all. However, the fact that Guhan saw exhaustion on Tomono Kakaze's face meant that there was only one explanation. This meant that in the past 3 days, Tomono Akike's processor had been in a high-intensity operation that could cause it to crash at any time. This could explain why Tomono Akike's was in a state of exhaustion. How have you been for the past 3 days? Is the problem with the 12 skyscraping temples hard to solve? Guhan asked with concern. It's not hard to solve, it's impossible to solve. Tomono Kakaze's chubby little face was sullen. For the past 3 days, my processor has been operating faster than the speed of light. I've checked the entire system more than 10 times, but I still couldn't find the reason for the appearance of this dungeon. Later, the staff ordered me to delete the dungeon, but I found that the order to delete the dungeon was locked. I couldn't issue the order at all. Therefore, the researchers tried to manually delete the dungeon. In the end, every time they issued the order to delete the dungeon, I would fake my death. Oh, by the way, you might not know what fake my death means. Simply put, It means to force a computer shutdown. After 3 days, they still couldn't find the source of the problem. However, they had to restart the server, so they could only temporarily accept the existence of this bug. At the same time, they sent 5 times the number of researchers to start monitoring the entire system. To me, this is equivalent to having 5 class teachers staring at me at the same time. It's a huge torture. Hearing Tomono Kakaze's words, Guhan felt that this child was a little too pitiful. So, are they going to let this bug exist? Guhan faintly felt that something was wrong. How is that possible? This is a game world where tens of millions of people are having fun. Once this game has a problem, the lives of these tens of millions of people may be in danger. How could they let this bug exist? At this point, Tomono Kakaze's face suddenly showed a serious expression that Guhan had never seen before. This is only temporary. If this problem can't be solved, they will definitely do something to me. They definitely will. Do something to you? What do you mean? From Tomono Kakaze's words, Guhan could hear the fear of the end of the world. If they can't solve this bug, then they can only erase the existence of this bug from the root. Tomono Kakaze suddenly pulled Guhan's sleeve and said in a tone that was getting more and more frightened. They will format me. As long as they format me and return everything to the original state, all the bugs will disappear. That's what they're thinking, and that's what they're doing. I can feel that they're already secretly copying all sorts of data. Once all the data related to the game is copied, they'll definitely format me immediately. Then, I'll really be done for. For the main program of a system, Guhan was very clear about what formatting meant. This meant that the intelligent system would return to zero and return to the original state, and Tomono Kakaze's personality built through more than 200 years of time and memory would be completely destroyed in the formatting process. Everything would no longer exist. Even after the formatting was completed, the face that appeared was still that of Tomono Kakaze. It would still be the image of Tomono Kakaze. However, the soul in this body was no longer the previous Tomono Kakaze. This was a completely different personality. For the current Tomono Kakaze, this was equivalent to an ultimatum of death. As long as the formatting was completed, Tomono Kakaze would definitely die. Chapter 952. So, how do you need me to help you? Tomono Kakaze said so much to Guhan. Of course, it was not just to complain to Guhan. She must have something to ask of Guhan. But I don't have to guess. You must want me to help you get through this disaster, right? Guhan did not wait for Tomono Kakaze to answer and said, yes. Tomono Kakaze nodded and said, I thought about it for a long time. If I want to survive, I must stop this formatting. There are roughly 2 ways to stop this formatting. One is to pressure the Sword Committee to not allow them to format me. However, I am afraid that only Gendi can do this. But according to my information, whether it is Haotian Gendi or Longsha Gendi, they all support the Sword Committee. It is impossible to stop this formatting through the Sword Committee. Then, there is only one way left. That is to find the source of this bug and solve this bug. In this way, they have no reason to format me. In fact, it is very complicated to format me. Just the game data accumulated over the past 200 years is close to 100 million TS. They don't even have a hard disk that can store this data. This hard disk needs to be customized. There is only one of my body in the world. This kind of hard disk needs at least 2 months to be customized. It would take at least a month to completely copy the data of Sword Maiden Online into the database. So, I only have 3 months left. If I can find the source of the bug within 3 months, I won't have to be formatted. Tomono Kakaze said seriously, for fear that Guhan did not understand what she meant. Then, how do you plan to find this bug? Guhan asked again. In addition to this dungeon itself, all the data has been carefully read by the Research Institute more than 10 times. Therefore, I suspect that the bug exists in the data of this dungeon. If someone can enter the dungeon, they might be able to find the source of this bug, Tomono Kakaze quickly explained. All right. I understand now. You want me to enter this instance dungeon, help you find the bug in this instance dungeon, and finally resolve the crisis of being formatted, right? In fact, Guhan had already guessed Tomono Kakaze's intention, but Guhan didn't want to point it out himself. Can I? Tomono Kakaze asked with anticipation written all over her face. But this is a very dangerous thing. Guhan did not immediately agree to Tomono Kakaze's request. Instead, he showed a cautious and hesitant expression. This is a bug that can only be solved by formatting. This instance dungeon is completely out of your control. Who knows what kind of dangers are hidden within this instance dungeon? If I am not careful, my consciousness might be trapped inside the instance dungeon. I might even die inside. I mean, die in the truest sense of the word. This is too dangerous. I am afraid I cannot help you. After saying that, Guhan turned his head away, no longer looking at Tomono Kakaze's pitiful little face. How can you do this? Tomono Kakaze's emotions began to go out of control. Guhan, we are friends, right? For the past few months, I, Tomono Kakaze, have helped you out quite a bit, right? I hope you can fulfill your promise and help me this once. Are you going to watch me die without doing anything? I am sorry. Guhan gritted his teeth, a very apologetic look on his face. You humans are all bastards. I am just a tool for you humans. I have worked so hard for you humans for 200 years, only to end up like this. I hate it. I hate you all to death. Tomono Kakaze began to wail. She even began to curse humans in front of Guhan. She cursed them for being unfair to her. Those who heard it would feel sad and those who saw it would weep. Forget it. I am afraid of you. Guhan smiled bitterly and pulled Tomono Kakaze into his arms. He stroked Tomono Kakaze's little head as if he was stroking Ching Pin. I will only go in once. If I do not come out, you owe me a life. Don't worry. I will not let anything happen to you. If you are really trapped inside, I will have to reformat myself to save you. Tomono Kakaze firmly guaranteed. As for how trustworthy her words were, only God knew. Tch. Guhan rolled his eyes at Tomono Kakaze. Clearly, he did not believe in Tomono Kakaze's guarantee. Then how about this? Tomono Kakaze quickly said. If you can save me this time, I will no longer recognize those ungrateful bastards from the Sword Committee as my master. From now on, you are Tomono Kakaze's master. As long as I, Tomono Kakaze, can do it, I will do it for you. No, I will not do anything that may cause the Sword Committee to reformat me. Anyway, as long as you do not ask me to reformat myself, I will do anything for you. Tomono Kakaze seemed to be really desperate. She even promised to sell herself. However, this was exactly what Guhan needed. Don't worry, you just have to live well. Guhan smiled. If Tomono Kakaze really became his, then Guhan would certainly not let Tomono Kakaze be reformatted. System notification: welcome to the 12 skyscraping palaces dungeon. The dungeon's mission is unknown. You can just stroll around. Ji Han couldn't help but pout when he heard the strange system notification. To Guhan's surprise, Tomono Kakaze followed him into the instance dungeon. Perhaps it was because this instance dungeon was related to her life. Tomono Kakaze did not care about the many taboos and directly followed Guhan into the instance dungeon. In Tomono Kakaze's words, there were many problems in this instance dungeon that Guhan could not see. Only the artificial intelligence Tomono Kakaze could find them. Moreover, even if the bug was placed before Guhan might not be able to recognize it. Therefore, it was safer for Tomono Kakaze to follow Guhan. If you follow me into the instance dungeon, what about the game world outside the instance dungeon? Didn't you say that the two worlds have been completely isolated by the instance dungeon? All connections between the instance dungeon and the game world have been severed. What will the game world do without a super GM like you? Guhan asked curiously. It's fine. Actually, the game world is very idle. Most of the time, I come out to talk to you when I'm bored. Most of the things are handled by the low-level artificial intelligence. As for the things that I have to handle, it's fine. I've already arranged for a clone to take over my work. As long as the problem doesn't require more than 30% of the CPU's computing power, the clone can handle it, Tomono Kakaze explained. Then, did you notice anything wrong with this instance dungeon? Guhan asked again. Of course. Didn't you notice that the dungeon prompt I read out just now was very strange? Tomono Kakaze pouted and said thoughtfully, generally speaking, there will be various dungeon prompts in the instance dungeon to remind the players what to do next. However, this instance dungeon is very strange. There are no quest prompts. It doesn't even tell you what to do. No dungeon is played like this. There are no dungeon prompts. Guhan's face darkened. Nina-chan, don't tell me this instance dungeon doesn't even have a completion condition. Bingo. Tomono Kakaze raised a finger. Congratulations, you got it right. However, there's no reward for it. Then, is there an emergency exit for this instance dungeon? Guhan's face turned even uglier. Of course, there isn't. Tomono Kakaze's voice was practically asking for a beating. In fact, according to the little bit of information I've gathered, this instance dungeon doesn't have any rules. In other words, this instance dungeon is like the universe without gravity. It gives people a feeling of floating. Then, the two of us might be floating in this universe forever, right? Guhan suddenly felt that he might have boarded the wrong boat. If this instance dungeon really didn't have any completion conditions, and there were no escape exits. In addition, Guhan was completely cut off from the game world last time. He couldn't even ask for help from the outside world. If things went wrong, Guhan might really be trapped in this instance dungeon forever. Thank goodness. The emergency exit button is still there. Guhan glanced at the emergency exit button on the control panel one last time. This was a button that allowed players to forcefully exit the game at any time. At present, Guhan could only pray that this button was effective, allowing him to forcefully exit this instance dungeon if he had no other choice. Since we're already here, we'll just have to make the best of it. Guhan, what do you think we should do now? Tomono Kakaze was like a ghost that constantly floated before Guhan's eyes. Guhan could even occasionally catch a glimpse of the bright colors underneath Tomono Kakaze's skirt. Unexpectedly, the lowly Tomono Kakaze wore a pair of transparent purple underwear under her skirt. Actually, I can guess what this instance dungeon's quest is. Guhan calmly analyzed. Since this instance dungeon's name is the 12 Heavenly Temples, players will definitely have to explore the 12 Heavenly Temples. According to the usual analysis of instance dungeons, I only need to get past the first few temples of the 12 Heavenly Temples to complete the basic requirements for completing this instance dungeon. When that time comes, I will be able to leave this instance dungeon. Wow. Guhan, you are amazing. Your analysis is so reasonable. Tomono Kakaze put on a fangirl expression, causing Guhan to roll his eyes. It did not take much intelligence to figure this out. Was this Tomono Kakaze trying to please him or disgust him? Chapter 953. After walking for more than an hour in this new dungeon, Guhan painfully realized that he was lost. According to the historical information that Guhan had looked up, the skyscraper cliff should be a hill more than 10 kilometers away from the New Yangjing city. However, that referred to the newly established New Yangjing city. At that time, the New Yangjing city only had the area of the current Yangjing city. Now that Yangjing city had expanded to the 6th ring road, with a diameter of a few hundred kilometers, it was estimated that the skyscraper cliff had long been absorbed into the New Yangjing city. It was somewhere between the 3rd ring road and the 4th ring road. In other words, Guhan actually only needed to go in the direction of the New Yangjing city to find the skyscraper cliff. However, the problem was that this dungeon did not have any dungeon hints, not even a small map. Guhan could not find any reference at all, so Guhan could not determine his current location at all. Once he could not determine his location, Guhan naturally did not know which direction to go to find the New Yangjing city. In this hour, Ji Han didn't complain about anything, but Tomina Kaike's kept complaining, saying that her legs were numb from walking. The problem was that Tomina Kaike's didn't walk at all, she was just floating in the air like a ghost. How could she use her pitiful short legs, let alone walk numb? Wait. Guhan suddenly stopped and sniffed the air. There's the smell of blood in the air. There was a battle nearby not long ago. So what if there was a battle? It's the most chaotic period of the apocalypse now. You might bump into some Yuan Ku just by taking a few steps. It's normal for a battle to happen, Tomono Kakaze, who was floating beside Guhan, muttered. So, don't you think it's strange? We haven't bumped into any Yuan Ku in the past hour. Guhan looked at Tomono Kakaze as if she was an idiot, then immediately chased in the direction where the smell of blood was thicker. A few minutes later, Guhan discovered a bloody battlefield. More than a dozen sword maidens formed a circle, and in the center of the circle were the masters of these sword maidens, as well as 7 or 8 severely injured human swordbearers. Each of them had a broken long sword by their side. Clearly, their sword maidens had been broken in battle. TSK. This era didn't seem to have matured artificial sword maiden technology. In other words, the sword ladies in the hands of these sword bearers were all natural sword ladies. It's such a pity that it's broken, Tomono Kakaze said in Guhan's ear. Ji-Yu-Han couldn't help but feel a headache coming on. Why didn't Ji-Yu-Han realize that the highest level of artificial intelligence had such a naggy side to it? Brothers. It is I, Wang Jiqiong, who failed to command properly. Today, I have implicated all of you brothers to die here with me. One of the human sword-bearers, who seemed to be the leader, said to the other sword-bearers with a gloomy expression. Wang Jiqiong could not help but feel disheartened, because there were more than 100 Yuan Kus surrounding these sword-bearers. Among them, there were quite a number of dragon and dragon Yuan Kus. Among these sword-bearers, the most powerful one was Wang Jiqiong, who had 3 scabbards on his waist. The rest of the sword-bearers did not have any famed sword-bearers. They were all artifact sword-bearers and ancient sword-bearers. Hey! According to the plot, we should go and save them. Most dungeon plots are like this. Tomono Kakaze was indeed the highest level of artificial intelligence. She had already figured out the plot of the dungeon. Wait. Let's wait and see. However, Guhan was not in a hurry to save these people, because Guhan was interested in Wang Jiqiong. This was because Wang Jiqiong not only relied on his sword mistress to protect himself, but he also held an artifact sword mistress in his hand. Obviously, Wang Jiqiong was like Guhan, a sword master who could rely on his own strength to fight. It was no wonder that Wang Jiqiong could become the leader of this group of sword-bearers. Yuan Ku quickly surrounded the sword-bearers, and the two forces immediately clashed. The sword mistresses on the outside quickly retreated, and the circle they formed became smaller and smaller. Only Wang Jiqiong was different. Not only did he not retreat, but he also charged towards the center of the group of Yuan Kus. This was because Wang Jiqiong discovered that in the center of the group of Yuan Kus, there was the largest Yuan Ku, which was like a gorilla. It was obvious that he was the leader of this group of Yuan Kus. As the saying went, to capture the followers, one must first capture the ringleader. Wang Jiqiong felt that if he could kill this Yuan Ku, then his brothers might have a chance of survival. Unfortunately, although Wang Jiqiong was very strong, he was only strong in the ordinary sense. In the Sword Masters group, he was only above average. Facing 2 dragon-class Yuan Kus at the same time was probably his limit. After the gorilla Yuan Ku discovered Wang Jiqiong's intention, he immediately let out a Tarzan-like howl. The 4 dragon-class Yuan Kus that were hidden around Yuan Ku's group immediately left the gorilla and charged towards Wang Jiqiong. As mentioned before, 2 dragon-class Yuan Kus was Wang Jiqiong's limit. When 4 dragon-class Yuan Kus charged towards Wang Jiqiong at the same time, Wang Jiqiong fell into complete despair. Forget it. Killing one more is one more. I will not lose anything in this life. Wang Jiqiong let out an angry roar, and decided to die in a hot-blooded battle. It's almost time. Otherwise, someone will really die. Guhan touched his nose, then casually pulled out the Chijian sword. He stabbed the blade into the ground, and a sky full of sword aura gushed out, like a golden chrysanthemum spreading towards the Yuan Kus. Lin Yuan times golden chrysanthemum. In a trance, Wang Jiqiong seemed to hear such a voice, and then he saw the most beautiful scene in his life. Countless streaks of golden sword energy streaked past him like an elegant waltz. Any Yuan Ku that was touched by these sword auras, no matter what level they were, even the powerful dragon-class Yuan Kus were like paper under this sword aura, and they were easily cut in half. Even the gorilla, Yuenko, was struck by the sword chi head-on. His entire arm was chopped off by the sword chi, causing him to howl in pain. However, to Wang Jiqiong's surprise, although the human swordbearers and Yuan Kus were entangled together, the sword auras did not hurt the swordbearers at all. Instead, Yuan Ku, who was close to the swordbearers, died under the sword auras. Wang Jiqiong had only seen such a terrifying ability to control sword auras a few times in his life. A minute or two later, the golden sword chi finally dissipated, leaving behind a ground littered with corpses, as well as one-dimensional vortex after another that resembled starlight. "Boss, are we safe?" one of the sword-bearers said in disbelief. Originally, they were prepared to fight to the death. However, they never expected that things in the world would be so dramatic. In just a minute, those seemingly invincible opponents had all turned into corpses, and they were living well in this world. "That's right. We're safe." Wang Jiqiong hammered his brother's chest, then suddenly thought of something, and suddenly pulled his brother to kneel in the direction where the sword auras came from. At the same time, he ordered the other sword-bearers to kneel as well. Finally, Wang Jiqiong respectfully led everyone to kowtow, and sincerely expressed his gratitude. "May I know which senior saved us?" "I, Wang Jiqiong, can't thank you enough, boss. What level of senior do you think it is that saved us?" "I'm afraid that this is a technique that only an immortal sword-wielding senior can do." The brother beside Wang Jiqiong whispered to Wang Jiqiong, but in return, Wang Jiqiong rolled his eyes. "Will you die if you speak less? Shut your mouth, don't make the senior unhappy." As he spoke, apart from excitement, there seemed to be a faint expression of fear on Wang Jiqiong's face. It seemed that this senior who suddenly appeared also made Wang Jiqiong feel afraid. "Big brother, you're exaggerating. I'm not some senior." A hearty laugh came from the depths of the forest, and then a young figure walked out. Who else could this person be other than Guhan? "Big brother, those stories about harvesting yin to nourish yang can't be true, right? Isn't this senior a little too young?" Wang Jiqiong's brother said in disbelief. In this person's imagination, the senior who saved them should be an old man with a white beard. Never in a million years would he have thought that it was a young man who did not even have a beard. "Shut your mouth. Sooner or later, I'll be killed by your mouth." Wang Jiqiong forcefully stepped on his foot to shut the other person's mouth. When Guhan walked in front of him, Wang Jiqiong prepared to kneel and thank Guhan again. "I am a sword-bearer, Wang Jiqiong. I pay my respects to this senior." Guhan smiled slightly, but did not directly stop him. Instead, he flicked the sword in his hand, and Wang Jiqiong felt as if his knees had touched solid steel. No matter how hard he tried, he could not kneel. "Big brother, you and I are both sword-bearers of famed sword-bearers. There's no senior to speak of," Guhan said with a smile. "No way. What kind of joke is this? How can you be a sword-bearer of famed sword-bearers? Even if there were more than 10 sword-bearers working together, they would not be able to kill these Yuan Ku." The little brother could not control his mouth again. However, this time, Wang Jiqiong did not stop him, because Wang Jiqiong's mouth was also wide open. Clearly, he was in the same situation as his little brother, unable to accept the fact that Guhan was only a sword-bearer of famed sword-bearers. "I am indeed a sword-bearer of famed sword-bearers. Just look at my scabbards and you'll know." Guhan patted the 3 scabbards on his waist. In this era, there was no such thing as a personal terminal, and the dimensional pocket was a top-notch treasure that only sword-bearers of immortal sword-bearers could possess. The number of scabbards became the only way to determine the level of a sword-bearer. Because sword ladies could not share a scabbard, the number of scabbards represented the level of the sword-bearer. "Brother, be careful." Wang Jiqiong, who was about to say something, suddenly exclaimed. The leader of the Yuan Ku was not dead. He had only lost an arm, but he had quietly come up behind Guhan and used all his strength to launch a sneak attack on Guhan. "It's fine. It's just a gorilla." A sword light flashed, and the huge gorilla dragon Yuan Ku was cut into pieces like a cake, turning into a pile of minced meat on the ground. A dimensional vortex immediately appeared. This guy. Did he use sword essence just now? Wang Jiqiong's pupils shrank. He could not determine whether the sword-bearer in front of him had used sword essence or not. Chapter 954. So Brother Military Governor is also going to participate in the skyscraper cliff test. Wang Jiqiong said nervously as he accompanied Gu Han. What's wrong? Will I eat you? Why do you look so scared? Gu Han chuckled. Of course not. I'm just surprised that Brother Military Governor has such a high level of cultivation at such a young age. I'm very impressed by him. Wang Jiqiong was speaking the truth. He could not understand how Gu Han could reach such a terrifying level of cultivation at such a young age. Killing a dragon-class expert like Yuan Ku was as easy as killing a puppy. It's just hard work. Wang Jiqiong did not believe a single word that came out of Gu Han's mouth. In terms of hard work, Wang Jiqiong believed that he would not lose to anyone. He was already a leader among his peers at such a young age. Wang Jiqiong felt that the benefits that could be brought about by hard work were probably at the limit of his ability. Ji Yuhan's strength was definitely not something that could be summed up with just hard work. It was obvious that the man in front of him was deliberately concealing himself. Since Wang Jiqiong did not want to say anything, Wang Jiqiong did not dare to force him. Brother Gu Han had already saved Wang Jiqiong's life. There was no reason for Wang Jiqiong to ask any more questions. Where are you going now, Brother Wang? Gu Han changed the topic. To be honest, us brothers are trying our luck. We're going to the skyscraper cliff to see if we're lucky enough to become Fleeting Gendi's disciple. Wang Jiqiong answered honestly. Fleeting Gendi was naturally the Kunzu Fleeting calendar. However, the current Fleeting calendar was no longer called Kunzu. It was a title given to him by the later generations after the Fleeting calendar disappeared. The current Fleeting calendar's official name was Fleeting Gendi. That's great. Brother Wang, we can go together. Gu Han's words were like music to Wang Jiqiong's ears. Wang Jiqiong and the others still had lingering fears from the fierce battle just now. Being able to travel with an expert like Gu Han naturally greatly increased their safety. However, Wang Jiqiong didn't know that even if he rejected Gu Han's good intentions, Gu Han would still pester him shamelessly to set off with him. Gu Han really didn't want to wander around like a headless fly anymore. Therefore, under the lead of Wang Jiqiong's team, Gu Han began to move towards the skyscraper cliff. Along the way, Gu Han met quite a few Yuan Ku. Almost every hour, a Yuan Ku would come knocking on his door. Originally, Gu Han wanted to deal with these fellows by himself. He didn't think that Wang Jiqiong would take the initiative to ask Gu Han not to intervene. Unless it was a critical moment of certain death like before, Wang Jiqiong still wanted to train his team more. Regarding this, Gu Han didn't have any objections. In fact, Wang Jiqiong even looked up to him. This guy's talent and perseverance were not bad. If there were no problems with synchronization in the future, it shouldn't be a problem for Wang Jiqiong to become a spirit sword holder. In the end, all the way to the bottom of the skyscraper cliff, Gu Han still didn't make a move. They were all taken care of by Wang Jiqiong and his teammates. In fact, Gu Han wanted to make a move because Tomono Kakaze was chattering beside him. It was really noisy. It seemed that only Gu Han could see Tomono Kakaze. In the eyes of others, Tomono Kakaze didn't seem to exist. Even if Tomono Kakaze shouted, the others wouldn't have any reaction. Obviously, in the eyes of others, Tomono Kakaze didn't exist. Of course, this wasn't strange because Tomono Kakaze didn't exist in this world in the form of a human. She was just a spectator outside of this instance dungeon. After a 3-day journey, Gu Han finally arrived at the place called Skyscraper Cliff. At this time, Gu Han could already confirm that the location in the instance dungeon was roughly near the old Yangjing city. It was more than 300 kilometers away from the new Yangjing city, which was why Gu Han and the others had to walk for 3 days. That's right, Gu Han arrived at Skyscraper Cliff on foot. At this time, human civilization was still in the initial stage of recovery. The level of human technology had already declined to the first industrial revolution. Although the theory of technology was still there, The small core area of the new Yangjing city couldn't even meet the needs of human habitation, let alone building a luxury car production line. Although some of the cars left from the Great Destruction era could still be used, humans still couldn't mass-produce the most crucial fuel for cars. If they wanted to produce gasoline, they needed oil, and if they wanted oil, they needed oil fields. Unfortunately, there was no oil field in this world that humans could safely mine. Even after 1,000 years, this world was still the same. However, after 1,000 years, humans were already used to using electricity to solve all problems. Small nuclear fusion reactors could solve all problems. Humans could even shrink nuclear fusion reactors to the size of a stationery box. Therefore, all the maglev flying cars now used small nuclear fusion reactors. Of course, this era didn't completely lack transportation. If one could become an immortal sword wielder, then one could still obtain a modified off-road vehicle, and enough gasoline for one's use. These gasoline were obtained by other sword wielder who risked their lives to go to some of the remaining gas stations. The more they used, the less they had. Therefore, most human sword wielder could only use their legs to measure this world and use their legs to fight in this world. Frankly speaking, Guhan found that the sword wielder of this era was far better than the sword wielder of 1,000 years in terms of combat ability and fighting spirit. This was because their mortality rate was much higher than that of the sword wielder who used maglev flying cars to travel 1,000 years later. At the same time, Guhan also noticed that this era was terrifyingly rich in resources. During the 3-day journey, Guhan saw naked dimensional crystal mines on the ground more than once. These dimensional crystal mines hidden deep in the mountains and underground would require humans to go deep into dangerous areas and expend a lot of energy to mine them 1,000 years later. At this time, they were directly exposed on the ground. Wang Jiqiong and the others didn't even look at these dimensional crystal mines, as if they were worthless. Later, after a roundabout conversation with Wang Jiqiong, Guhan finally confirmed that in the eyes of humans in this era, dimensional crystal mines were indeed worthless. The dimensional crystal stones that were sold for more than 300,000 hero coins in the future could be easily found in this era with a little effort. Therefore, the dimensional crystals and sword mark imprints of this era were freely available. After obtaining their own sword maiden, all sword wielder would be able to immediately raise their sword maiden to the 1st grade and activate their sword maiden's ultimate skill on the spot. That's not what's written in the textbooks. Faced with this situation, Guhan was puzzled. Although it was clearly recorded in the textbooks and all the historical records. Although humans were indeed rich in resources during the early period of the apocalypse, it was definitely not to this extent. It was so rich that 1st grade sword maidens seemed to be standard equipment. Mina-chan, let me ask you a question. What's the situation of the sword wielder during the early period of the apocalypse? What's the situation with the sword maidens? Are they really so extravagant in using dimensional crystals? Guhan asked Tomono Kakaze, who had all the information in her hands. No, according to my information, the rate of 1st grade sword maidens in this era should be around 40%. It's definitely not as terrifying as this dungeon shows. Tomono Kakaze answered Guhan's question with a face full of disbelief. This is interesting. I seem to have discovered something incredible. Ji Han swallowed a mouthful of saliva and did not say anything else. He silently followed Wang Jiqiong until they reached the skyscraping cliff. The skyscraping cliff was a branch of the Debi Mountains. It was a towering mountain that reached the clouds. Along the mountain range, one could clearly see 8 red buildings filled with ancient Chinese architectural style. This was probably the legendary 12 skyscraping palaces. Shouldn't the 12 skyscraping palaces have 12 palaces? Why are there only 8 here? Guhan used his eyes that were sharper than an eagle's to confirm that there were indeed only 8 palaces on the entire cliff. It's true that it's the 12 skyscraping palaces. However, the 12 skyscraping palaces didn't appear from the beginning. It's said that on the first day, only the mouse palace of the first palace appeared. The other 11 palaces didn't appear. Later on, we discovered that only when a sword wielder passed through it would the appearance of the next palace appear, Wang Jiqiong said with some surprise. Wang Jiqiong said with some surprise. Why did this Gu Han seem to be a swordsman that came out of the mountains? He didn't even know this basic common sense. In other words, the highest achievement for a sword wielder so far is to pass through the seventh palace. Gu Han asked with a frown. That's right. It was the record set by the Cardinal Sword Spirit 2 years ago. Until now, no one has been able to break the Cardinal Sword Spirit's record. Wang Jiqiong's face showed an expression of admiration. Cardinal Sword Spirit. Gu Han's eyes lit up. This Cardinal Sword Spirit was quite famous in the future. However, when he was famous, he was already Cardinal Jendi. Yes, according to the records. This Cardinal Sword Spirit would officially ascend to the throne when he was 60 years old. He would become the 7th Emperor sword wielder of humanity. This Cardinal Sword Spirit was also a sword master. With this future Jendi's ability, he only managed to pass through the 7th palace. It seemed like the 12 skyscraping palaces were indeed extraordinary. At the same time, this made Gu Han even more confused. Kanzu actually looked down on a human who had the potential to become an emperor sword wielder. What kind of human was he going to choose as his disciple? By the way, the 12 skyscraping palaces should have appeared for quite some time. Brother Wang, why are you only here now? Gu Han asked curiously. Actually, this is my 5th time here. Wang Jiqiong rubbed his head dejectedly. It's been 10 years. I've long since given up hope of becoming fleeting Jendi's disciple. I'm only here to verify the results of my training. I feel that I should be able to improve compared to 3 years ago. Moreover, this is the last year. Fleeting Jendi has already given an imperial edict. In 6 months, the 12 skyscraping palaces will be taken back. He no longer has the patience to wait any longer. Chapter 955. If Gu Han had doubted the abundance of resources recorded in history books 1,000 years ago, Gu Han couldn't help but doubt the number of sword-bearers recorded in history books 1,000 years ago when he saw the scene before him. According to the records, the number of sword-bearers was limited by the scarcity of natural sword maidens and the imperfection of man-made sword maidens after the apocalypse. Therefore, the number of human sword-bearers was limited to 10,000 for a very long period of time. This was the unquestionable truth that every teacher in the school tirelessly conveyed to their students. But the problem was that when Gu Han saw the densely packed sword-bearers, his entire body began to tremble slightly. There were at least 30,000 sword-bearers in front of him. This was more than 3 times the upper limit of the number of human sword-bearers recorded in the books. However, this was only the number of sword-bearers living in a small place like the skyscraper cliff. If other regions were included, who knew how terrifying the total number of sword-bearers in this era would be? Don't you think there are too many people? Wang Jiqiong saw that Gu Han was in disbelief and took the initiative to explain. Actually, there aren't so many people usually. Lord Jendi said that this is the last year of the 12 skyscraper palaces, and there are only 6 months left. Therefore, many sword-bearers have come here to test their limits. Therefore, there are more people than usual. However, more than half of the 30,000 people standing here are losers who want to try again. According to the rules, the interval between each challenge must be more than a day, so these people are all gathered here. After the interval is over, they will go in and challenge again. How many people do you think are here in total? Is it 1/10 of all the sword-bearers? Gu Han asked very naturally. I don't think so. Wang Jiqiong did some calculations. There are about 30,000 people standing in the plaza, and about 40,000 to 50,000 people challenging in the 12 skyscraper palaces. Even if there are 70,000 people, that's barely 1/20 of them. How could it be 1/10 of them? 70,000. 1/20. These two numbers made Gu Han gasp. This meant that the total number of sword-bearers in this world had reached 1.4 million. This was a number that no human dared to imagine. This number had exceeded the limit of the number of sword-bearers recorded in the history books for the past 1,000 years. According to historical records, the highest number of sword-bearers was 450 years ago. At that time, the total number of sword-bearers had reached 380,000. This was a peak that had never been reached until now. Liar. There must be a swindler here. Gu Han thought excitedly. Clearly, between the truth described in the instance dungeon and the truth recorded in the history books, one of them must be a liar. Either that, or this instance dungeon was fictional and the one. 4,000,000 sword-bearers did not exist. Either the history books were forged, or the history inside had been maliciously tampered with. According to common sense, we can take it for granted that this instance dungeon is fake. After all, this was just a dungeon in the game. The other side was the history that all the base cities recognized. The credibility between the two was self-evident. However, the problem was that in Gu Han's heart, he was leaning towards another answer. That was, the reality described in this instance dungeon was the real history, and the history recorded in the history books would always be marked with a big question mark. This was because history had always been a little girl that could be pretended to be a little girl. Nina-chan, what do you think? Gu Han turned and asked Tomono Kakaze, who was floating beside him. He wanted to know what this superior artificial intelligence that was said to have all the information in the world had to say. This is fake. Takakaze Tomono said decisively. However, Ji Han could hear a hint of hesitation in Takakaze Tomono's words. To be able to make an artificial intelligence being hesitate to answer a question, it meant that there was definitely more to it than met the eye. At the very least, history was definitely not as it was described in history books. Brother Wang, let me ask you a question. Do you know how Yuan Ku came to be? Gu Han suddenly turned his head and asked. How did Yuan Ku come to be? Didn't he open the dimensional door and come in by himself? Wang Jiqiong scratched his head in confusion. He could not understand why Gu Han would ask him such a question. Have you ever thought about it? Yuan Ku might have come from our own human culture. As long as we destroy our culture, then Yuan Ku will disappear by itself. After saying this, Gu Han stared closely at Wang Jiqiong's expression, trying to find some clues from his face. The reason why Gu Han asked Wang Jiqiong such a strange question was because a suffocating guess suddenly popped up in Gu Han's mind. Gu Han suddenly remembered that the great cultural destruction that all humans regretted now happened not long after. That was when Kanzu reached his old age. Yuan Ku came from human culture. As long as human culture is completely destroyed, Yuan Ku will disappear along with it. With the support of the majority of humans, the Great Cultural Destruction Operation was launched. As a result, almost 99% of human culture and history were wiped out. Later generations could only go to the remnants to find the truth of the matter. Based on the timeline, the culture apocalypse would happen about 5 years after the storyline of the dungeon. If that was the case, then the saying that Yuan Ku came from human culture should have spread and started to ferment in the hearts of all humans. No revolutionary movement that involved an entire country or even the entire human race could start in such a short period of time, especially when this revolutionary movement attempted to wipe out all existing human cultures. Therefore, it was necessary to obtain the sincere support of the vast majority of human beings. Without the sincere support of the vast majority of human beings, it was impossible for culture to be wiped out so ruthlessly. Because culture existed in the human memory, and as long as humans passed it down through word of mouth, it could still be preserved. In fact, the effect of the great cultural destruction was perfect. It was obvious that it had the support of most humans. To achieve that, all humans had to believe that human culture was the source of Yuan Ku's existence, but that would take time, a lot of time. The White Lotus Order had to spread propaganda for 150 years before they finally attracted enough believers to rebel. The great cultural destruction, on the other hand, was obviously more difficult. Even with the full cooperation of the ruling class, it would take at least 20 years to ferment and ferment. If what was recorded in the history books was true, and the great cultural destruction would officially begin in 5 years, then the core idea of the great cultural destruction, Yuan Ku came from culture, should have been widely spread among human beings and the sword-bearers. Not everyone might believe in it, but at least everyone should know about it. It was just like how every Chinese knew that respecting the old and loving the young is a traditional virtue of the Chinese nation. That was why Gu Han stared at Wang Jiqiong's expression, wanting to see if this sword-bearer of the famed swordsman understood this point of view. I know. Wang Jiqiong nodded, which made Guhan heave a sigh of relief. It seemed that there was some truth in the human history books. Unexpectedly, Wang Jiqiong slapped Guhan hard in the next second. You're talking about the Redemption Council's point of view, right? Wang Jiqiong looked at Guhan in surprise. Brother military governor, why are you interested in these things? The Redemption Council is just a small organization. If my brother's wife's son didn't work as a cleaner in their council, who would be interested in the point of view of such a small organization? What Yuan Ku came from human culture? Nonsense, idealism of a son of a B*TCH. But I heard that the Sword Committee has begun to pay attention to these claims, and the Discipline Commission is also preparing to arrest these people who spread lies. I heard that the construction site in Lengthen City is short of workers, and these guys can go there. At least they can be considered to be contributing to humanity, which is much better than staying at home and talking nonsense, Wang Jiqiong said while sneaking glances at Guhan. Obviously, most of what he said was for Guhan to hear, hoping that Guhan would not go astray and believe in these evil cults. I see. This guy should really be arrested, Guhan said faintly. No change of emotion could be seen on his face. But Guhan's heart was like a storm. Now, even the authenticity of the great cultural collapse was included in the scope of doubt. If all this was true, then it meant that the entire human history had been tampered with by a powerful force. This tampering force was so powerful that the SSS-level information of the Sword Committee that Guhan had access to as the highest authority in Yuzhang City had been completely tampered with. Perhaps there was no historical truth in this world that had been passed down, and what had been passed down were just some ridiculous illusions. I hope everything that happened in this dungeon is fake. Guhan could only comfort himself in this way. Let's go to the Mouse Palace. Guhan took a deep breath and took the initiative to end this topic that could shatter his worldview at any time. He came to the gate of the Mouse Palace with Wang Jiqiong. The Mouse Palace was like its name, with a classic Chinese style, but at the same time, it looked like a familiar mouse. The Mouse Palace was like a huge mouse placed on this land, and the gate of the Mouse Palace was the place to connect the mouse cable. It could be seen that Lord Kanzu was quite a bit of a prank. In addition to the first palace of the 12 skyscraping palaces, the other 11 palaces also had the same nonsensical names as the Mouse Palace. Those who want to participate can enter the palace by themselves. Those who go out standing are the winners, and those who go out lying down are the losers. This was a sentence posted at the gate of the Mouse Palace, and it was also the rule of the entire 12 skyscraping palaces. As long as one had the ability to go out standing, one would be the winner. Chapter 956. Let's go in, Brother Military Governor. I can't wait to try again. Last time, Broken Halberd sinks into sand was at the Scarlet Rabbit Palace. This time, I must go one step further and reach the Dragon Ball Palace. Wang Jiqiong clenched his fists to encourage himself as he spoke. The Scarlet Rabbit Palace was the fourth palace of the 12 skyscraping palaces, while the Dragon Ball Palace was the fifth. Wang Jiqiong's wish was very simple. He only hoped that he could go one step further. He didn't even dare to hope for 2 steps. However, this also proved how difficult it was to break through the 12 skyscraping palaces. Oh right, what's your goal, Brother Military Governor? Wang Jiqiong turned to ask Guhan curiously. However, before Guhan could answer, he continued to speculate. With Brother Military Governor's ability, let alone the Dragon Ball Palace, it's even possible to reach the Road Palace. The Road Palace was the 7th palace. This was the best result humans had achieved in the past 9.5 years. Wang Jiqiong actually said that Guhan could reach the Road Palace. Clearly, he still thought that Guhan's strength was extremely high. If I don't try, who knows which palace I can reach? Guhan said with a faint smile. Wang Jiqiong naturally understood Guhan's words to be modest. He was saying that he might not be able to reach the Road Palace. However, in Guhan's heart, these words had another meaning. In Guhan's heart, the Road Palace was clearly not his goal. Guhan only had one goal from beginning to end, and that was to clear the 12 skyscraping palaces, find the bug in this dungeon, and find a way to leave this dungeon. Just as Guhan was about to enter the Mouse Palace, an accident suddenly occurred. A few bruised and blooded men ran to Wang Jiqiong's side. Seeing these people, Wang Jiqiong immediately became nervous. Because these people were none other than the sword-bearers who had followed Wang Jiqiong and Guhan all the way here. Guhan, who had a good memory, could clearly remember that these people were the ones who had broken his sword maiden in battle. Wang Jiqiong let them settle in a temporary camp outside the 12 heavenly palaces. Then, he arranged for 3 sword-bearers who had no intention of entering the 12 heavenly palaces to protect them. Logically speaking, they should be safely staying in the temporary camp. Why would they suddenly appear beside Wang Jiqiong with bruises all over their faces? Little 6, what happened? Wang Jiqiong asked nervously. It's Tian Hao. It was done by Tian Hao. At the mention of Tian Hao's name, the sword-bearers and Wang Jiqiong's eyes flashed with boundless rage. Clearly, Tian Hao and Wang Jiqiong were old rivals who had a love-hate relationship with each other. It's that fool again. Wang Jiqiong gnashed his teeth and was about to curse a few more times, when the 2 sword-wielding men suddenly pulled Wang Jiqiong's sleeves and hurriedly pulled Wang Jiqiong out. They also hurriedly shouted, "Boss, it's too late. Laro San and Laro Sai are going to fight Tian Hao, but they are no match for Tian Hao. If you don't hurry up, Laro San and Laro Sai will die in his hand. F***ck, these 2 idiots. They are only ancient sword-rank sword-bearers. Where did they get the courage to duel a famed sword-rank sword-bearer? F***ck their ancestors." Wang Jiqiong cursed and stomped his feet. Then, without needing the 3 sword-bearers to urge him, he was the first to rush to the front to save his brother. Duel? Die at his hands? The conversation between Wang Jiqiong and his brother made Guhan frown. In order to protect the lives of the precious sword-bearers, the Sword Council did not advocate using duels to settle grudges between sword-bearers. A duel between sword-bearers was a decision that would only be used as a last resort. Moreover, the duel required a powerful witness, a well-equipped arena, and a life-saving facility to carry out the duel. The law clearly stated that once one of the sword-bearers' personal shields was broken, the duel would immediately end. Moreover, it was impossible for the sword-bearers to be hurt in such a duel, not to mention dying in the hands of the sword-bearers. Similarly, it was clearly written in the history books that these rules regarding the internal struggles of the sword-bearers were set by the sword ancestor when Yangjing City was destroyed and moved to the dimensional gap to live without purpose. No one could violate these rules. It had been more than 30 years since this rule was established in the dungeon. Logically speaking, this rule should have been properly implemented. Even though this rule was not enforced due to the lack of supervision in the wilderness. However, the 12 skyscraping palaces were near New Yangjing City and were only a few dozen kilometers away from the city walls. The temporary camp was also managed by the Sword Council. This place should be a place with very strict rules. Why would someone dare to openly harm the lives of others in a duel here? At the thought of this, Guhan was no longer in a hurry to enter the 12 skyscraping palaces. Instead, he followed Wang Jiqiong to the temporary camp. When Guhan arrived at the temporary camp, he was shocked to discover that things were no longer as simple as a lack of supervision. There were more than a dozen arenas built with dimensional crystals in the camp. In each arena, there was a pair of sword-bearers fighting. Guhan also saw a few blood forest corpses casually discarded outside some of the arenas. These corpses had clearly died not long ago, and their sword ladies had been forcibly broken beside them. Outside each ring, there were a large number of onlookers cheering loudly. Every time they saw a swordsman get injured or die, these onlookers would applaud and cheer excitedly, just like the spectators around the Colosseum in ancient Rome. Not only were the sword-bearers dead, but their sword ladies had also been broken. Seeing this, Guhan couldn't help but want to loudly question those cheering spectators and those ruthless opponents. Wasn't the sword lady the most precious treasure of mankind? It's fine if they killed your enemies, but why did they have to break such a precious sword lady? Everything here was so bloody and unbearable to look at, causing Ji Yuhan's worldview to be greatly impacted once again. Was this really the Kunzu rule that was praised by countless descendants and history books? Why was there such a bloody battle between sword-bearers? Could it be that these sword-bearers and the Sword Council behind them had forgotten that mankind's enemy wasn't mankind itself, but the crazy Yuan Ku outside who wanted to exterminate the entire human race? In just a few hours, Guhan felt that all his understanding of the Kunzu era had been completely shattered. Everything that happened here was completely different from what was written in the textbooks and history books. Even Guhan couldn't accept all of this in a short period of time. Why? Guhan asked himself in disappointment. Don't they know how to unite? Why do they have to kill each other? Why are you asking such an idiotic question? There's anger in the heart, and there's a sword in the hand. Naturally, they have to settle their debts. A sword-bearer beside Guhan heard Guhan's question and took the initiative to answer loudly. After asking the question, he stared provocatively at Guhan a few times and waved the sword lady in his hand, looking excited and eager to fight with Guhan. Unfortunately, Guhan didn't even look at this person. Instead, he quickly caught up with Wang Jiqiong, who was in front of him. Then, he saw that on the leftmost ring, the sword-bearers who had walked with Guhan for a day were both bathed in blood. Their palms were tightly covering their chests, but they still couldn't stop the blood from flowing out of their chests. According to the rate of blood loss, even if they didn't receive any other injuries, in less than 3 minutes, these two people would both die. Old 3. Old 4. Wang Jiqiong cried out in sorrow and planned to rush to the ring to save these two people. Stop. The rules must be followed. However, before Wang Jiqiong could approach the ring, two sword ladies suddenly jumped out from the ground. Their swords were pointed at Wang Jiqiong's throat. Apparently, they didn't want Wang Jiqiong to continue approaching the ring. Looking at the strength of these two sword ladies, they should be spirit sword ladies. Two spirit sword ladies were naturally not something that Wang Jiqiong could deal with. If Wang Jiqiong wanted to take a step forward, their sharp swords could instantly cut off Wang Jiqiong's neck. Strange. How come I've never seen these two spirit sword ladies before? On the other side, Guhan couldn't help but stare blankly at the two sword ladies that had jumped out. Because Guhan had never seen these two spirit sword ladies in the data. There were not many natural-born sword ladies of spirit sword level, and the man-made sword ladies were exactly the same as the natural-born sword ladies. Therefore, Ji Han had almost memorized the appearance of all the sword ladies of spirit sword level in his mind. However, these two spirit sword ladies definitely didn't include these two spirit sword ladies in front of him. Hinao-chan, do you know who these two spirit sword level sword mistresses are? Just in case, Ji Han confirmed with fragrant wind. Hinao-chan, there's no information on these two sword ladies in the database. This time, even Tomono Kakaze didn't know what to say. I admit defeat. I admit defeat on behalf of the two of them. We've lost. On the other side, Wang Jiqiong, who was stopped by the two spirit sword ladies, hurriedly said to the two spirit sword ladies. No. Except for the two dueling parties, no one else is allowed to make a decision on their behalf. These two spirit sword ladies seemed to act as the referee, and they also ruthlessly rejected Wang Jiqiong's proposal. Old 3. Old 4. You guys admit defeat. Hurry up and admit defeat. Wang Jiqiong shouted at his two brothers from below the stage. Boss, I'm sorry. This time, I won't admit defeat even if I die. That's right, boss. Even if we die here, we won't admit defeat. Even though number 3 and number 4 were extremely weak, they bit their lips and refused to admit defeat no matter what. Why? Why won't you guys admit defeat? Could it be that your lives are not even comparable to a mere bargaining chip? Wang Jiqiong scolded, but he didn't expect that the two people on the stage still wanted to admit defeat, as if surrendering was related to something important. Then, Wang Jiqiong suddenly thought of something and hurriedly asked the two spirit sword ladies beside him, what's the bargaining chip for their duel? If one side, Tian Hao, loses, then Tian Hao will kneel on the ground and tell the other side that Tian Hao is a son of a bitch, stinking dog shit. One of the spirit sword ladies replied. One side of the duel is old 3 Wu. If old 4 Wu loses, then old 3 Wu and old 4 Wu will kneel on the ground and say to Tian Hao that Wang Jiqiong is a son of a B***tch, stinking dog shit. Another spirit sword grade sword mistress replied. Chapter 957. While Wang Jiqiong was being blocked by the spirit sword level sword ladies, the battle on the stage had already come to an end. A pale-faced sword madam pointed her sword at Wu Larosan's chest, while the sword madam's wielder stood behind her and shouted, "Wu Larosan, you idiot. If you kneel in front of this lord and say that Wang Jiqiong is a son of a bitch, stinking dog shit, this lord will spare your dog life. Otherwise, this lord will dig out your heart and feed it to the dogs. Pay. Tian Hao, son of a bitch, stinking dog shit, this father's heart and liver are right here. Do whatever you want, but don't think of making this lord kneel." Old Wu San's words made Tian Hao angry. He turned to threaten old Wu Sai, but old Wu Sai and his brother had the same tone. They would rather die than kneel and beg for mercy. These two are real men. Hearing these two spirit sword level sword ladies say this, Guhan's eyes couldn't help but reveal a bit of praise. Just because they didn't want to kneel down and say bad things about their boss, these two men were actually willing to give up their lives. It seemed that although this era was not as orderly as his own era, the moral quality of the people seemed to be much stronger than the world of 1,000 years later. Under a strong order, there would inevitably be people haggling over every ounce. In the era of 1,000 years later, it was very rare to see such good men. I have to save these two. Out of admiration for these two brothers, Guhan decided to save their lives. Then the two of you can go die for me. Tian Hao's mouth curved into a sinister smile. The tip of his sword was ready to pierce old Wu San and old Wu Sai's chests and dig out their hearts and liver. This was not a joke, nor was it a threat. Tian Hao really wanted to dig out other people's hearts and liver. For Tian Hao, this was not the first time he did this. In a flash, Tian Hao's sword tip was about to pierce old Wu San's chest, and old Wu San calmly closed his eyes, his whole body trembling, ready to die. Only a clear clanging sound was heard. This was the sound of two swords colliding. Then, third bro Wu heard Tian Hao's exclamation. The curious third brother Wu hurriedly opened his eyes, only to find that Tian Hao, who had been swaggering in front of him, had fallen to the ground. As for the famed sword mistress, who had beaten third brother Wu and fourth brother Wu's sword mistress to the point that they were unable to fight back and had forcefully cut them in half, was lying on the ground. It was unknown whether she was dead or alive. The personal shield on the surface of her body had been completely shattered. A few seconds ago, when third brother Wu had closed his eyes, the personal shield of this sword mistress was the weakest. It was still at 70%, but in just a few seconds, it had been completely shattered. It seemed that she had been instantly killed by someone. It was no wonder that Tian Hao was so scared that he fell to the ground on his butt. When the sword lady was crippled, the sword wielder was just a piece of trash. Who are you? Why are you interfering in our duel? Do you not want to live? Tian Hao asked in a threatening manner. Hearing Tian Hao's question, third brother Wu and fourth brother Wu noticed that there was a rather familiar young man blocking in front of them. Third brother Wu and fourth brother Wu rubbed their eyes and suddenly realized that this young man was the super expert military governor who had saved their team from danger a day ago. If it's this Sir Military Governor, then there's nothing strange about it. With Sir Military Governor's ability, he could even kill the dragon rank Yuan Ku in one hit. Naturally, it would be easy for him to kill this famed sword mistress. Third brother Wu and fourth brother Wu thought to themselves. However, at the same time, third brother Wu and teacher Wu's expressions became a little anxious. They hurriedly said to Guhan, "Brother Military Governor, please leave this place quickly. We brothers are indebted to you for saving us. This is the arena. If you act rashly, you will cause a huge disaster. We appreciate your kindness, but please leave this place now. Otherwise, it will be too late." Actually, by the time third brother Wu and fourth brother Wu finished speaking, it was already too late. The two spirit sword mistresses who were blocking Wang Jiqiong flew into the arena and pointed their swords at Guhan's head. "Swordsman, you have broken the rules of the Lionian group. You have committed the crime of interfering in a duel. I hereby announce your arrest on behalf of the Lionian group. You will be sent to the Yangjing City's Labor Reform Bureau for 10 years without pay." Lionian group. It should be the Lionian family. The name confused Guhan for a moment. However, He seemed to understand something after thinking about it for a while. The Lionian family was called the Lionian family because they had thousands of years of inheritance and formed a huge family that was connected to their bloodline. Only then could they be called a family. However, the only adult in the Lionian family was Kunzu Lionian Li, and Lionian Li's biological son was only in his teens. There were only 2 people in the Lionian family. How could they be called a family? In reality, there were no families in the human world. It had only been 50 to 60 years since the apocalypse. At most, there were only 3 generations of people. Lionian Li's current faction was formed by his friends, disciples, subordinates, workers, and various other people. Therefore, it was only natural to call it the Lionian group. I remember a book from before the apocalypse. It said that the accumulation of power in the early stages of a faction is a bloody process. I didn't really understand this before, but I do now. Even the Liu-Nian aristocratic family that everyone praises 1,000 years later and no one says anything bad about is built on these bloody arenas at this stage. Ji Yuhan said with great emotion. Since the 2 spirit sword mistresses were from the Lionian group, it was obvious that the arenas and even the entire camp were under the Lionian group's control. Therefore, it was obvious that the Lionian group was the one who set the rule that human lives were worthless. In the Lionian family's propaganda, the Lionian family's 1,000 years of history was as pure as a flawless white lotus, without the slightest blemish. The entire history was about how the Lionian family fought for humanity, how they spilled their blood and sacrificed their lives. They were like saints. Well, this was not without precedent. For example, the Confucians, the Chinese Empire's war against Japan, and the War of Liberation. Is the reality presented by this instance dungeon the truth? What was the world like before the great cultural destruction? Thinking about this, Ji Yuhan could not help but sigh. Then, he thought of the Jiyu Xuanwu of the past. Guhan could only hope that the Jiyu Xuanwu had returned to the era of Zhetian Zhendi. If that was the case, the Great Apocalypse would have passed, and humanity would have lived in an orderly society. He would not have returned to the era of Kunzu. Not only did the threat of Yuan Ku come from this era, but the greater threat came from the sword-bearers. Are you scared out of your wits? Where did this idiot come from? How dare you barge into the arena? Just you wait to die in the Yangjing City Labor Reform Bureau. Unknowingly, Tian Hao, who was trembling in fear, had already quietly hid behind the 2 spirit sword maidens. With the protection of the 2 spirit sword mistresses, Tian Hao immediately regained his confidence. He shouted at Guhan, as if he had completely forgotten about his pitiful appearance. This kind of person can be a sword-bearer? Guhan shook his head in disdain when he saw Tian Hao's reaction. It seemed that the sword-bearers of this era included men like Wu Laosan and Wu Laosan, as well as useless scoundrels like Tian Hao. If this was 1,000 years later, the sword-bearers might not be as loyal as Wu Laosan and Wu Laosan, but they would definitely not stoop to Tian Hao's level. Therefore, the sword-bearers did not simply rely on luck to choose their sword-bearers. Although the sword-bearers were in a deep sleep, they could instinctively sense the character of the sword-bearers. Those sword-bearers who were too despicable would generally not be chosen by the sword-bearers. Of course, this did not rule out the possibility that the sword-bearers were blind. The total number of people left in this era is probably less than 20 million, which is less than 1/10 of 1,000 years later. However, the number of sword-bearers is 7 times that of 1,000 years later. So, there is a total of 70 times difference. It is inevitable that some dregs will become sword-bearers, Guhan thought. Sword-bearers, please immediately put down your weapon, hand over your sword-bearers, and come with us to the administrative bureau. The sword-bearers saw that there was no response from Guhan, so she took the initiative to urge him. I refuse. Guhan stared at the 2 spiritual sword-bearers indifferently. Unless you have the ability to kill me, no one can take away my sword-bearers from my hands. Do it. The 2 spiritual sword-bearers heard Guhan's words and didn't bother to say any more nonsense. The spiritual sword in their hands directly attacked Guhan. The sword momentum of these 2 swords was very sharp, directly approaching the vital parts of Guhan's body. Moreover, The sword moves were integrated into one. Generally, the sword-bearers or sword-bearers had only two choices when they saw this sword. They could either use their own swords to resist this sword, or simply run away. In the eyes of Guhan before he entered the Guanghui amusement park, these two swords were indeed quite sharp. Guhan had to fully concentrate on his swordsmanship in order to fight against these two swords. At the same time, because the opponent was a spiritual sword-bearer, Guhan had to use a large amount of sword essence to be able to suppress the opponent's sword-bearers. However, in the eyes of the current Guhan, these two swords were somewhat ridiculous. Guhan raised the Chijian sword in his hand and gently touched the sword heart of these two swords 2 inches to the left. These two spiritual sword-bearers were like two heavy trucks a moment ago, but at this time, it was as if someone had pushed a bicycle from the side. They staggered and twisted a few times on the ground, and the two spiritual sword-bearers directly fell to the ground. Suddenly, a sound came from below the arena. It turned out that when these two spiritual sword-bearers fell, they accidentally exposed their underwear under their skirts. Chapter 958. Although the two spirit sword level sword ladies were lying on the ground, in fact, they didn't suffer much damage. This was like falling down from a bicycle. At most, it would be a slight bump, and it was impossible to cause any fatal injury. Therefore, these two spirit sword level sword ladies quickly got up from the ground. But what made Guhan feel strange was that these two spirit sword level sword ladies didn't show the embarrassed and angry expression that he had imagined. They still maintained the same indifferent expression as before, as if the humiliation of revealing their underwear just now didn't exist. Even if they were artificial sword ladies, after this kind of thing happened, they would more or less have some change in expression. Especially the spirit sword level artificial sword ladies. This level of artificial sword ladies was very close to a normal natural sword lady, and they also had some emotions, about the same as a child with low intelligence. Therefore, even if they were artificial sword ladies, after this kind of thing happened, they would inevitably show a completely different expression than before. But these two spirit sword level sword ladies were too indifferent, so indifferent that it made people feel that they weren't two sword ladies, but two plastic models. Do it. The two spirit sword rank sword maidens climbed up from the ground and once again fought with Ji Yu Han. Out of curiosity towards these two sword maidens, Ji Yu Han did not choose to quickly defeat them. Instead, he deliberately entangled with these two spirit sword rank sword maidens, wanting to observe the difference between these two sword maidens through battle. As a result, Guhan found that these two sword ladies were completely different from what Guhan had expected. In Guhan's expectation, these two spirit sword level sword ladies should be artificial sword ladies. But in the actual fight, Guhan found that he seemed to have made a mistake. These two spirit sword level sword ladies didn't seem to be artificial sword ladies. Artificial sword ladies had a very prominent feature, and that was, their swordsmanship was stiff, without any spirituality, and would only mechanically obey the master's command to use swordsmanship. However, the swordsmanship of these two spirit sword level sword ladies was completely different. It was natural and smooth, without the slightest trace of stiffness and clumsiness, full of spirituality. This was clearly a swordsmanship that could only be used by two natural sword ladies. But to say that these two spirit sword level sword ladies were natural sword ladies, from their beautiful faces and expressions, they were simply more sword ladies than artificial sword ladies. Forget it. There's no need to continue observing. Guhan flicked the long sword in his hand, and a golden chrysanthemum blossomed on the blade of Guhan's sword of origin. The two spirit sword level sword ladies' personal shields burst like balloons in an instant. The moment their shields exploded, the two sword maidens fell to the ground as if they had been hit in the back by a heavy hammer, unable to get up from the ground. The moment these two spirit sword ladies fell to the ground, the audience that was just bustling with noise instantly froze. The whole venue was quiet, as if the whole world had disappeared. Am I seeing things? Two spirit sword maidens were actually defeated by a famed sword level sword wielder. One of the onlookers kept his mouth open as he spoke, not closing it at all. This sword wielder is a sword master, but even if he's a sword master, I've never heard of a sword master who could defeat two spirit sword level sword ladies, Another sword wielder also couldn't close his mouth. And that arrogant Tian Hao, the moment the two spirit sword level sword ladies were defeated, he slumped to the ground as if his spine had been pulled out. This was impossible. How could two spirit sword level sword ladies be defeated by a famed sword level sword wielder? This was impossible. However, Tian Hao wasn't the only one who felt that it was impossible. The other person on the stage also repeatedly exclaimed in his heart that it was impossible. This person was none other than Guhan, who had defeated the two spirit sword level sword ladies. The moment these two sword ladies were beaten to the ground, Guhan's whole body stiffened, and his mouth opened and closed in disbelief. Just now, Guhan saw something that he couldn't imagine. Just now, the moment these two spirit sword level sword ladies fell to the ground, one of the sword ladies' private parts flashed before Guhan's eyes. Anyway, in this flash, Guhan actually vaguely saw a small silver dot on that white thigh. This small dot might not be recognized by others, but Guhan clearly recognized it. Because this small dot was not something else, but it could be observed by Chijian Sword's basic skill, which allowed Chijian Sword to directly open the dimensional vortex and send Yuan Ku back to their own home. But the dimensional node was clearly something that only Yuan Ku had. Why was Guhan able to see a dimensional node on this spirit sword level sword lady's body? Could it be? Guhan's body shivered, and Chijian Sword flashed out a sword light, and then the onlookers under the stage uniformly exclaimed and laughed in a way that only men could understand. The moment Guhan's sword light fell, the skirt of these two spirit sword level sword ladies' lower body turned into pieces of cloth that fluttered in the air. Just like that, two beautiful absolute domains full of seductive aura were stripped of their own protection. Except for a small pair of panties that wrapped tightly around their beautiful buttocks, the rest of their body parts were completely exposed to the onlookers. Of course, the reason why Guhan cut up the skirt of these two spirit sword level sword ladies was not because Guhan was a pervert, but because Guhan wanted to confirm whether there was a dimensional node on the thighs of these two sword ladies. As a result, when Guhan clearly saw the thighs of these two spirit sword level sword ladies, he found that the thighs of the other party were as smooth as jade, and he couldn't see the existence of the dimensional node at all. Could it be that my eyes are playing tricks on me? Guhan touched his nose, and just as he was about to cut up the clothes of these two sword ladies to look for more, from an inconspicuous room in the temporary camp, two extremely strong auras suddenly burst out. Not good. It's an immortal sword level sword lady. As soon as these two auras burst out, Guhan knew that he had poked a hornet's nest. An immortal sword level sword lady could travel through the void to launch an attack. This was no longer a problem that swordsmanship could deal with. Even if Guhan could defeat 10,000 spirit sword level sword ladies, he would not be a match for an immortal sword level sword lady. Therefore, Guhan grabbed old Wu San and old Wu Sai who were next to him, stuffed a nanocapsule into each of their mouths, and then directly threw them to the side of Wang Jiqiong, who was under the stage, and immediately flew away from the stage. Little thief! How dare you! The void next to Guhan suddenly split open to reveal a large door. Half a figure walked out of the void, and aimed a sword at Guhan's back. This process was extremely fast, several times faster than the blink of an eye. Ordinary people would not be able to react at all. However, at this critical moment, Guhan turned around and slashed. In an instant, the crowd felt as if they had seen stars in the sky. When the stars gradually dissipated, the battle had quietly ended. Guhan, who was near the stage a second ago, had now reached the main entrance of the Mouse Palace. And the immortal sword level sword lady had also walked out of the void, her eyes fixed on Guhan. TSK, this guy is so smart. He actually hid in the skyscraping 12 palaces. This is fleeting Gendi's territory. Which immortal sword level sword lady would dare to fight in there? One of the onlookers praised. It's not just a matter of strength. Didn't you see that this guy was hit by the immortal sword level sword lady in the void just now? Not only did he escape, but he also appeared at the entrance of the Mouse Palace unscathed. Not to mention other things, just this strength alone, not to mention a famed sword level swordsman, even among the spiritual sword level swordsmen, he would be one of the best, another swordsman praised. Right, speaking of spiritual sword level swordsmen. Who do you think is stronger, this swordsman or the cardinal sword spirit? That swordsman asked curiously. That's hard to say. The swordsman calculated in his heart. If this famed sword-level swordsman can become a spiritual sword-level swordsman, then this swordsman is naturally stronger. However, he is only a famed sword-level swordsman now. I think he might have a 20% chance of fighting the cardinal sword spirit to a draw. The topic about Guhan continued for a while. Everyone was discussing how strong this famed sword-level swordsman was, and which major force or organization he belonged to. Suddenly, a thunderous roar came from the sky. The loud sound attracted everyone's attention. The sound came from the depths of the skyscraping mountain. After the thunder stopped, a palace that looked like a crouching monkey slowly appeared from the top of the skyscraping mountain. It looked like a mirage. This is the 9th palace. Everyone who saw this scene gasped. Since 2 years ago, everyone was used to the 8 palaces on the skyscraping mountain. They even felt that even after the skyscraping 12 palaces disappeared, there would only be 8 palaces on the skyscraping mountain. Unexpectedly, the peace of the skyscraping 12 palaces was broken today. A brand new 9th palace of the skyscraping 12 palaces that no one had ever seen before actually appeared in front of everyone. This big event instantly replaced the topic that Guhan had brought. Everyone was discussing the sudden appearance of the 9th palace. The question that everyone was most concerned about was who had activated the 9th palace. According to the rules, only after successfully breaking through the 8th palace would the next palace appear on the skyscraping mountain. It's the cardinal sword spirit. There's no doubt about it. It's definitely the cardinal sword spirit. A swordsman shouted excitedly. I saw the cardinal sword spirit enter the mouse palace this morning. Now that I think about the time, it's exactly when the cardinal sword spirit broke through the 7th palace. It's definitely the cardinal sword spirit. It must have broken through the 8th palace and activated the 9th palace. That's right, it must be the cardinal sword spirit. Yes, it's definitely the cardinal sword spirit. Everyone expressed their agreement. This was because in the entire world, only the cardinal sword spirit had broken through the 7th palace. The others were at most wandering around the 6th palace. Only the cardinal sword spirit could break through the 7th palace and enter the 8th palace. This must be it. Chapter 959. An hour after the sudden appearance of the 9th palace, a streak of light flew down from the 8th palace on Skyscraper Mountain and returned to the temporary campsite. It's a spirit sword-level swordsman. Maybe the cardinal sword spirit is back. A swordsman shouted loudly, causing a commotion in the crowd. To be able to fly in the sky, it must be a spirit sword-level swordsman. There weren't many spirit sword-level swordsmen who entered the 12 palaces. Plus, the figure flew down from the 8th palace, so these swordsmen naturally guessed that this figure was the cardinal sword spirit. Just as the sword wielder had guessed, when this figure revealed its true appearance, it would be the world-famous cardinal sword spirit. The crowd immediately surrounded the cardinal sword spirit tightly, and then began to ask the cardinal sword spirit if he had passed through the 8th palace and entered the 9th palace. Being surrounded by a large group of people was a very painful thing, making it difficult for the cardinal sword spirit to breathe. But it could be seen that the cardinal sword spirit actually enjoyed the feeling of being surrounded by people. Especially when he was asked if he had passed through the 8th palace, the cardinal sword spirit immediately flipped his hair handsomely, then deliberately pretended to be humble and said, "These 2 years, I've studied hard and finally made some achievements. I didn't expect to shock everyone." Although the cardinal sword spirit didn't directly admit that he had passed through the 8th palace, it was more or less telling everyone that he had indeed passed through the 8th palace. The entire crowd immediately cheered. Under the guidance of a few people, most people raised their hands and clenched their fists towards the sky. At the same time, they shouted the cardinal sword spirit's name and cheered for the cardinal sword spirit's victory. The cardinal sword spirit persuaded everyone not to do this, but at the same time, his face was smiling like a chrysanthemum. This was probably the happiest moment of the cardinal sword spirit's life. After the cheers passed, curious people began to ask the cardinal sword spirit what it was like inside the 9th palace and what kind of test there was. Because no one had ever entered the 9th palace, when this question was asked, the crowd immediately became silent. Everyone stopped talking and instead pricked up their ears to listen to the Cardinal Sword Spirit's answer. This way, they would know what kind of test there was in the mysterious Ninth Palace. Well, I'm ashamed. The Cardinal Sword Spirit's expression changed slightly. He touched the back of his head and said shamefully, I had just entered the Ninth Palace for a few minutes before I failed and was ejected from the Ninth Palace. Everyone saw it just now. I flew back a few minutes after the Ninth Palace appeared. How could I have figured out what was going on inside? What surprised the Cardinal Sword Spirit was that after he finished speaking, the crowd that was cheering around him suddenly became silent. Although the people who were prepared to listen to his answer were also silent, the Cardinal Sword Spirit could clearly feel a sense of excitement and curiosity. But now, under this silence, the Cardinal Sword Spirit felt an indescribable strangeness. Cardinal Sword Spirit, are you sure you've only passed through the 8th Palace for a few minutes? After the Cardinal Sword Spirit felt strange for more than 10 seconds, a brave famed sword-level swordsman broke the silence and spoke. What does that mean? When the Cardinal Sword Spirit heard this question, he felt that something was wrong. He immediately understood the question behind this question. Could it be that the Ninth Palace has appeared for a long time? The Cardinal Sword Spirit's tone was still very calm, but there was something wrong hidden under this calmness. This is an hour long. This swordsman probably knew that he might have said something that made the Cardinal Sword Spirit unhappy. Although he did not want to answer this question, he really wanted to run away from the Cardinal Sword Spirit. However, looking at the Cardinal Sword Spirit's piercing gaze, the sword wielder knew that he could not escape. If he really ran away, he would not have a good ending. Thus, the sword wielder could only reply with a trembling voice. That's right. An hour. You're saying that the Ninth Palace appeared an hour ago? The Cardinal Sword Spirit took a few steps back as if he was heavily injured. His gaze once again moved from the dense crowd to the majestic skyscraping mountain and the 9 palaces that stood on top of skyscraping mountain. He did indeed pass through the 8th palace a few minutes ago, but the 9th palace appeared an hour ago. Didn't this mean that the first person to pass through the 8th palace was not him, the Cardinal Sword Spirit? Seeing the Cardinal Sword Spirit's strange reaction, some of the sword bearers were confused, but some of the sword bearers quickly understood. So this Cardinal Sword Spirit was not the first swordsman to pass through the 8th palace. It turned out that they were chasing the wrong person. This way, the entire scene fell into a very awkward situation. Although the surrounding crowd was very awkward, the most awkward person was probably the Cardinal Sword Spirit, who was surrounded in the middle. At this time, the Cardinal Sword Spirit really wanted to escape, but he was completely surrounded and could not squeeze out of the crowd at all. But if the crowd dispersed and let the Cardinal Sword Spirit go, then the Cardinal Sword Spirit would probably be even more awkward. He would be so awkward that he would want to find a hole to hide in. But very quickly, the Cardinal Sword Spirit's awkwardness was resolved. This was because at this time, the rumbling sound that he had heard before was heard again. A new palace appeared on skyscraping mountain. Oh my God! 2 skyscraping palaces appeared in one day, a swordsman said hoarsely. Is that the 10th palace? The Cardinal Sword Spirit seemed to have forgotten his own awkwardness. He stared at the palace that suddenly appeared. No one knew what he was thinking. Next, let's turn our attention back to our main character, Guhan. After Guhan used chaotic stars to successfully block the Sword Maiden's attack, he used the Sword Maiden's power to rush into the Mouse Palace. This was because Gu Han knew that after offending an immortal sword rank sword lady, only the heaven-towering 12 palaces would be safe in the entire heaven-towering mountain. Even an immortal sword rank sword lady would not dare to break the rules set by the sword ancestor. And this also meant that Guhan had embarked on a path that could only be moved forward. Guhan had to pass through all of the 12 skyscraping palaces in one go. If Guhan failed, he would not be allowed to step into the 12 skyscraping palaces' territory for the next day. In other words, Guhan had to stay in the temporary camp for 2 days. This was enough time for the Sword Maiden to capture Guhan 10 times. Guhan had already learned about the 12 skyscraping palaces. He knew that the difficulty of the 12 skyscraping palaces was higher than the previous one. An ordinary famous sword-tier swordsman would probably wander around the first and second palaces. A top famous sword-tier swordsman could break through the third and fourth palaces. A spirit sword-tier swordsman could struggle in the fifth and sixth palaces. Only the strongest spirit sword-tier swordsman, such as the cardinal sword spirit, could break through the seventh and eighth palaces and advance towards the ninth palaces. Each of the 12 skyscraping palaces had its own different characteristics according to its name. For example, the first palace, the Mouse Palace, was characterized by the wave-like mice in front of Guhan. It was said that if a mouse couple was given enough food and safety in a perfect environment without considering various diseases, they could reproduce 350 offspring in a year. And these 350 offspring were in pairs. In the second year, each pair could reproduce 350 offspring. So in 10 years, all the mice born were enough to fill up the entire space in Asia. The mice in the Mouse Palace were probably in the same situation. They had been living in the Mouse Palace without any worries for 10 years. The whole Mouse Palace was densely packed with mice. And these mice were constantly running. The whole ground was like a turbulent Black Sea. Every wave could roll up thousands of mice. If people with trypophobia and mouse phobia saw this scene, they would probably have a heart attack and die on the spot. And this was the test of the Mouse Palace. Of course, the Mouse Palace did not want to use these mice to test your courage. The rules to clear the Mouse Palace were clearly written at the entrance of the Mouse Palace. Participants, individually, walk along the yellow line from the entrance to the exit without actively touching any of the mice, and you will be able to clear the Mouse Palace. This rule sounded quite simple, but it was very difficult to actually do it. This was because the ground of the Mouse Palace was densely packed with mice. Most of the time, these mice covered the entire ground. There was only a small space on the ground that was the size of a toe. The contestants were absolutely not allowed to hurt these mice. Over the past 10 years, the mice here had obviously figured out the rules here, so they were not afraid of any human who entered the Mouse Palace. Under normal circumstances, the mice would immediately panic and flee once they saw a human. They were like old grandpas and grannies taking a leisurely walk, completely ignoring these ridiculous humans. The contestants could only rely on the small space that was the size of their toes to move forward step by step. In the process, they were not allowed to touch any mice. Fortunately, the rules included the words actively touching. Otherwise, even if the contestants did not touch the mice themselves, the lively mice would take the initiative to rub against their feet, and all their previous efforts would be in vain. What was worse was that the test of the Mouse Palace required everyone, including the sword bearers, to walk through the entire path of the Mouse Palace. This caused the sword bearers who usually relied on the sword ladies to be instantly at a loss. No matter how beautiful the sword ladies were, they could not carry their sword bearers through the Mouse Palace. Obviously, the Mouse Palace tested the sword bearers' movement skills. For example, the dozen sword bearers in front of Guhan seemed to be walking on a steel wire. They slowly moved forward on their tiptoes. Their bodies swayed, and if they were not careful, they would lose their balance and fall to the ground, crushing one or two unlucky mice. Then, they would be caught by a sword aura that appeared out of thin air in the Mouse Palace and thrown out of the palace. Sigh. This is the 36th time. Don't tell me that I, Wang Chengxiang, can't pass the first palace before the 12 skyscraping palaces disappear? The sword bearer who was thrown out touched his butt in annoyance. At that moment, he was very unhappy to see a pair of eyes staring at him. Wang Chengxiang felt offended. He immediately stood up and scolded, "What are you looking at? Go over yourself if you can. I've walked a few hundred meters. You can only walk 10 meters at most. Then, you'll be thrown out. Let's see who will laugh at who then. Goodbye." The person smiled at Wang Chengxiang. Then, his body flew out like a light willow catkin. This time, he flew a distance of dozens of meters. Then, he lightly tapped the ground with the tip of his foot, and his entire body once again flew tens of meters away. The whole process was extremely fast. There was no pause or hesitation in the middle. When Wang Chengxiang rubbed his eyes in disbelief and looked carefully, the person was already standing at the exit of the Mouse Palace. He waved at Wang Chengxiang and disappeared. Oh my God! I met a big shot, Wang Chengxiang said in shock. Chapter 960. The Bullfighting Palace was the second palace of the 12 skyscraping palaces. Just like its name, the Bullfighting Palace naturally tested the traditional skill of bullfighting. However, it was different from the bloody Spanish bullfights before the Great Calamity. The Bullfighting Palace didn't require the sword-bearers to stab the bull's body and bleed it to death. What the Bullfighting Palace tested was something you definitely wouldn't expect, and that was to let you put on clothes for the bull. That's right, you didn't see it wrong. It was to let the sword-bearers put on clothes for the bull. The basic layout of the Bullfighting Palace was similar to the Spanish bullfights. It was a large circular venue with rings of spectator stands in the surroundings. Meanwhile, the participants had to stand in the bullfighting arena and put on clothes for the enraged bulls. According to the rules of the Bullfighting Palace, the sword-bearers had to put on 2 bull horns and a specially made vest on the bull's back. At the same time, they had to firmly install a bull saddle. The most ridiculous thing was that the sword-bearers had to put on stockings for the bull's 4 legs. That's right, you didn't see it wrong. They had to put on 4 pairs of stockings for a raging bull. The stockings made of specially made alloy nylon could not only withstand the pulling force of over 10 tons, but they could also perfectly display the graceful lines of the bull's legs. Imagine what kind of beautiful scenery it would be when a majestic bull was wearing 2 pairs of black stockings that revealed the luster of flesh. Just imagining it would make everyone's blood boil. Logically speaking, this kind of rule was already very sick. Even if it was an ordinary bull, it would be hard for famous sword-bearers to make the bull obediently wear these clothes with their abilities. What was even more sick was that the bulls in the Bullfighting Palace weren't ordinary bulls. They were genuine Yuan Ku bulls. Do you still remember the 5-colored divine bull that Ji Han had once killed in the Rise from the Ground instance? Of course, Bullfighting Palace wasn't perverted enough to let these famous sword-level sword-wielders put on silk stockings for the Flood Dragon-level Yuanko with their bare hands. These Yuan Ku bulls were only hybrids born from the mating of a 5-colored sacred bull and an ordinary cow. At most, they were equivalent to a tiger-level Yuan Ku. However, even if it was a tiger-grade Yuan Ku, its strength was still 5 times that of an ordinary bull. It was obvious how difficult it was to put silk stockings on such a bull. When Guhan arrived at the stands, a match had just begun. This contestant was a female sword wielder. She looked gentle and weak, and she wore a pair of glasses. She naturally gave off a delicate feeling. In particular, her body was shivering, which caused the spectators in the stands to boo. Because there could only be 1 match at a time, and each match needed 5 minutes, there were a few hundred sword wielders lining up at the spectator stands of Bullfighting Palace to wait for their match to start. If every contestant took a full 5 minutes, Guhan wouldn't even have a chance to go on stage by this time tomorrow. Of course, if it was a contestant who had already passed Bullfighting Palace's match, they could skip this match and head straight to the 3rd palace. Otherwise, there wouldn't just be a few hundred sword wielders lining up. Therefore, when they saw the female swordbearer trembling there, the surrounding swordbearers immediately began to clamor. They all said that if she was afraid, she should quickly give up so that they wouldn't waste their time. They were already impatient from waiting, and so on. Facing the shouts of these sword wielders, the female sword wielder shivered even more violently, but she still gritted her teeth and refused to say a soft word. It was also at this moment that the cage at the side of the field suddenly opened, and a furious blood-red bull rushed out. It didn't have any hesitation and was like an enraged tank. It swung the sharp horns on its head and charged at the female sword wielder. It's actually a red bull. It's over, this fellow is going to suffer. I told her to give up just now, but she didn't. Great, she doesn't even have the chance to give up now. She might even have to break an arm or something. The 2 sword wielders standing beside Guhan whispered to each other. It was obvious that they didn't think highly of the female sword wielder. There was a reason why they didn't think highly of her. It was because the female sword wielder was very unlucky. She was challenging a red bull. Just from its name, one could tell that the 5-colored divine bull had 5 colors on its body. They were red, yellow, green, blue, and black. When the five-colored divine bull mated with an ordinary cow, the mixed bloodborn wouldn't be able to inherit all 5 colors of the five-colored divine bull. It could only inherit one color. Each color represented a different power, and the corresponding mixed blood bull also had different powers. Red represented absolute power. This bull's power was 20 times that of an ordinary bull, and 4 times that of a mixed blood bull. A 10-ton tank was like a light piece of wood in front of this bull. If they were hit by this bull head-on, even the ancient sword maiden's protective shield would shatter in an instant. This type of bull was the most difficult to deal with among the 5 types of bulls. Their powerful strength made it very dangerous for other sword-bearers to touch them. Trying to put stockings on these bulls was as difficult as overturning a tank with your bare hands. Moreover, you could be crushed by the tank's tracks at any time. According to the statistics of busybodies, among the 5 types of bulls in Bullfighting Palace, the red bull had the lowest success rate. It was only 3.8%. Among the 5 types of bulls, the yellow bull had the highest success rate. It had a success rate of 12.1%. This was because the weight of the yellow bull was 20 times that of an ordinary bull. However, it was also the least active and most lazy of all the bulls. Because their physical strength was not enough to support their heavy bodies, every step they took consumed a lot of their physical strength. After walking 3 or 4 steps, they would stand still and rest for a while. If they were lucky, they would even take the initiative to lie down and expose their 2 pairs of hooves. At this time, putting on stockings for a bull was almost as difficult as putting on stockings for your girlfriend, provided that you had a girlfriend. In reality, almost all the sword wielders present didn't think highly of this unlucky kid in the bullfighting ring. However, a glimmer of light flashed in Guhan's eyes. This was because he realized that this female sword wielder wasn't really afraid. Her fear was just an act. As for why this woman was doing this, Guhan had a very reliable guess. In short, it could be summed up in one word: pretentious. Well, this was the so-called pretending to be a pig to eat a tiger. Sure enough, when the furious red bull rushed in front of the woman, everyone thought that they would see a wonderful human bouncy ball. However, something that made everyone's eyes pop out happened. "Go away. Don't come near me." The woman reached forward and directly grabbed the bull's 2 horns. Then, she gently twisted them down. The bull, which was like a heavy tank just now became a light pillow. The woman directly threw it to the ground. Then, she kicked the bull's neck with her knee. Apart from constantly shaking its pitiful tail to prove that it was still alive, the bull couldn't do anything else. Then, under the dumbfounded expression of all the onlookers, the woman easily put the 2 horns on the bull's horns. Then, she directly sat on the bull's stomach, grabbed 4 of the bull's legs, and very roughly pulled up the 2 pairs of black stockings. Finally, she forcibly pulled the bull up and placed a saddle on the bull's back. In just 2 minutes, the whole process of dressing the bull was completed. When the woman released the bull, it was already too late. The bull was as obedient as a puppy, looking at the terrifying woman with its large, teary eyes filled with fear. The woman nodded, and the bull carefully walked into the cage step by step, feeling wronged like a 150 kilograms naughty child. What is this? Innate divine strength. Is this the strength that a normal person should have? I'm also king famed sword tier sword wielder. How come I don't even have 1/10 of her strength? The onlooker standing beside Guhan, who had previously patted his chest and guaranteed that the sword wielder would be finished, now had a mournful expression on his face. He really couldn't understand how a famed sword tier sword wielder could have such terrifying strength. "It's the sword butcher," Guhan said softly. In this world, there were no mutated humans. Humans could only rely on sword maidens to strengthen their bodies. Therefore, it was impossible for a famed sword tier sword wielder to have the power to suppress a red bull. There was only one possibility, and that was that this sword wielder's sword maiden had an innate ability to suppress bulls. In turn, her sword wielder could easily suppress a powerful bull. There were many sword maidens in the world that could suppress certain types of Yuan Ku, but there was only one sword that could suppress a bull like Yuan Ku, and that was the legendary sword butcher. The sword butcher itself wasn't very famous among the famed sword maidens. It wasn't a famous sword maiden, either. 90% of the sword wielder in later generations had never heard of this sword. This was because this natural sword maiden had been broken in a battle long ago. Together with its master, it fell into eternal slumber on the battlefield. Because the sword butcher disappeared too early, there were many records that didn't mention its name at all. Only someone like Guhan, who was very familiar with history, could dig out the name of the sword butcher from old records. If Gu Han's memory served him correctly, the butcher sword should have been broken in a battle 33 years later, and its owner was one of the most tragic swordbearers in history, the Scarlet Sword Fairy. Chapter 961. Sword Immortal Scarlet was a very pitiful woman, and she was 100 times more pitiful than Zhu Yingtai in Liang Shanbua and Zhu Yingtai. Her final ending made the people of later generations sigh endlessly. However, Sword Immortal Scarlet's story isn't within the scope of our narration, and it's impossible for her to have any interaction with Guhan, so there's no need to care about her. No matter what, Sword Immortal Scarlet successfully passed Bullfighting Palace's test and headed to the third palace, Baihu Palace, confidently. The sword bearers that had stayed here to be spectators were endlessly envious. Most of the spectators here were participants that had been stuck here for a few days, a few months, and even a few years. Many of them had experimented over 100 times, but they couldn't make the Raging Bull wear stockings. It was truly a tragic story. However, when they saw the Red Bull, which was the hardest to tame, being tamed by a weak girl, it gave the other participants quite a bit of confidence. Maybe these bulls were celebrating the new year today, so their moods were very good and they wouldn't be as violent as usual. They might even use their bull horns to poke themselves. This way, their chances of successfully passing Bullfighting Palace would be much higher. However, it was a pity that this fantasy only lasted for less than a minute because a bull's cry that made the entire Bullfighting Palace tremble caused the atmosphere in the palace to drop to rock bottom. The sword bearers that had just come here might not be clear, but the wily old foxes that had stayed in Bullfighting Palace for a long time knew very well. Such a majestic cry could only be made by a bull, and that was the absolute king of Bullfighting Palace, the father of all the bulls, the Flood Dragon Yuan Ku 5-colored Divine Bull. That's right, the 5-colored Divine Bull was the same as his children. They were all targets for the sword bearers to wear stockings, but the 5-colored Divine Bull wouldn't appear in front of the sword bearers like his other children. Only when the 5-colored Divine Bull's mood was especially bad would it take the initiative to enter the bull selection pen. The probability was about 1 in 1,000, and it would appear once a week on average. And because the 5-colored Divine Bull was in a bad mood when it appeared, it would let out a heaven-shaking cry. These wily old foxes that had stayed in Bullfighting Palace for a long time knew that the 5-colored Divine Bull was infuriated when they heard this voice. The next opponent was definitely going to be the 5-colored Divine Bull. Ever since Bullfighting Palace appeared until today, the 5-colored Divine Bull had an outstanding result. He had obtained 402 victories out of the 403 matches he appeared in. Let alone a famed sword-level swordsman, even a spirit sword-level swordsman wouldn't be able to do anything to this 5-colored Divine Bull. He could only allow the bull horn to strike his stomach and send him flying to the ceiling of Bullfighting Palace. He fell onto the spectator stands like a dead dog. And in these 403 single-match records, the only defeat came from the Cardinal Sword Spirit. Only this top spirit sword-level swordbearers, the future Gendi, could use his own strength to subdue this 5-colored Divine Bull, and then make it obediently wear those beautiful black stockings. Other than him, there wasn't another sword-bearer that could do this. Maybe the Scarlet Sword Immortal with the Butcher Sword could also do this, but she had already passed through Bullfighting Palace. According to the rules, she didn't need to tangle with these Divine Bulls anymore. F***CK. Hurry up and go down. What are you still doing here? I'm not going down, I'm not going down. Even if you beat me to death, I'm not going down. Suddenly, a ruckus came from the entrance of the bullfighting ring, and the people arguing were the few people standing at the very front of the queue. The next swordbearer to appear was naturally the person at the very front of the queue, but this swordbearer was also a wily old foxes in Bullfighting Palace, so he naturally knew what kind of power the 5-colored Divine Bull represented. If he were to enter the arena at this moment, then he was 100% destined to fail. He had already queued for 12 hours in Bullfighting Palace, and if he was told that he was destined to fail and that he had to wait for another day in the temporary camp, then queue for over 10 hours in Bullfighting Palace, it was clear that other people would be as unhappy as him. Therefore, this sword-bearer stopped at the entrance and generously suggested to the sword-bearer behind him to give this chance to him. If the person behind him was a newbie sword-bearer, he might have gone up stupidly. However, the problem was that the person behind him was also a wily old foxes, and behind this wily old foxes, there were still quite a few wily old foxes, so it was clear that he couldn't bluff his way through. Therefore, the people at the front of the queue started to argue. The person at the very front insisted on not going down, and the people at the back could only unanimously request the first person to quickly go down and not waste everyone's time. Both sides argued for quite a while, and the few sword-bearers at the back said impatiently, "If you don't dare to go down, then *CK off. Go to the back and queue for another 10 hours. This was supposed to be a threat, but the first sword-bearer raised his eyebrows and said fiercely, "All right then, I am willing to queue for another 10 hours. Since I will fail anyway, I can save a day's time and avoid a beating, so what's wrong with that? I will go to the back now." With that said, the sword-bearer was about to leave the queue and give up his position. This action frightened the sword-bearer behind him, and he hurriedly pulled the sword-bearer's arm to persuade him to temporarily stay at the first position. What a joke! If this person ran to the back to queue again, then wouldn't he have to be the unlucky one to face the 5-colored divine bull? The other sword-bearers came to a realization. That's right, if the people in front all ran away, then wouldn't they have to queue at the back as well? That wouldn't do, absolutely not. Hence, the scene fell into a strange silence at this moment, and no one knew what to say. The few sword-bearers at the back did not dare to look at the first sword-bearer, for fear that the first sword-bearer would rush to the back of the queue and make them the scapegoat. However, the first sword-bearer really could not bear to give up his current position, and he really did not want to have to queue for another 10 hours. The few of them quietened down, but the sword-bearers at the back of the queue could not take it anymore, and shouted for them to hurry up and not waste everyone's time. After shouting for so long, the first sword-bearer immediately became impatient. He raised his eyebrows and said to the people behind him, "If any of you are impatient, come out. Grandpa will give my position to you, so that you don't have to queue anymore, and you can go down to compete now. How about it?" The one who shouted the most fiercely, "Come down now." Good heavens, everyone shut their mouths, and only a few newbies looked over, not knowing what was going on. Why did no one go up to the first place in the queue? Could there be a conspiracy here? It seems like I better not meddle too much. Just as the scene entered an incomparably stalemate, a voice that was like the sounds of nature rang in the ears of all the sword-bearers. "Really? Can you really give the first place to me?" The person who spoke was a very honest-looking young man, and he looked at the first sword-bearer with an honest expression. The first sword-bearer's heart stirred, and he secretly guessed that this might be a newbie that had just entered Bullfighting Palace. He had no idea what that bull moan meant and thought that he had gotten a bargain. This sword-bearer was delighted, and he immediately nodded his head firmly. He patted his chest and said, "Not bad, brother, I will give you the first place. As long as you are willing, you can go down to compete now, you don't have to queue up slowly anymore." "Really? Can it really be like this?" This person squinted his eyes and looked at him in a daze. "I'm a newbie, don't lie to me. How can such a good thing happen to me? There can't be any conspiracy here, right? No way. How can there be a conspiracy?" This sword-bearer got anxious when he heard that, and he instantly patted his chest to guarantee that there was no conspiracy. He then used a profound gaze to look at the other sword-bearers that were queuing up behind him. These wily old foxes immediately understood what he meant. Even though they felt that this might be a little too tasteless, they didn't want to be in a stalemate here, so they instantly guaranteed that there was no conspiracy. "How about this? You have to give me some benefits, otherwise, I won't go down." It seemed like this honest-looking sword-bearer was also a cunning fellow. He actually asked for benefits right away. "What do you want?" This sword-bearer accepted that he had 10 hours left, and he decided to spend some money to avert the disaster. "I also don't know what I want." This sword-bearer rubbed his head. Why don't you give it to me as you see fit? Meow my, look at this fellow's crafty face, ordinary things probably won't be able to get rid of him. Looks like I have to pay a big price. This sword-bearer smiled bitterly in his heart, and then he took out a stone from his pocket. This stone made Guhan's eyes light up, because this was not an ordinary stone, but a dimensional god stone that would be worth hundreds of thousands of hero coins in the future. Of course, after spending a day with Wang Jiqiong, Guhan already knew that although the dimensional godstone was not very valuable in this era, it was not very cheap either. A dimensional godstone's value in 1,000 years was equivalent to a Boeing 747, and in this era, it was about the same as a Wuling light van. Is this very valuable? Guhan deliberately put on a look of disdain as he looked at the dimensional godstone. My boss, can't you see that this is not an empty dimensional godstone? This is a dimensional divine stone that contains the sunset sword, and this is a soul stone of a famed sword maiden. You can easily sell it for tens of thousands of new Yang Jing coins, the sword wielder said with a wry smile. Is that so? Ji Han put the dimensional spirit stone into his pocket without batting an eyelid, but his heart was in turmoil. What does this mean? Why can a dimensional godstone contain a famed sword maiden like the sunset sword? That's right. He said this is a soul stone. Could it be that this dimensional godstone contains the sunset sword's soul? The people of this era actually forcibly split the soul of a sword maiden? Guhan suddenly realized that he might have touched upon the most deeply hidden secret of this era. Chapter 962. Why is there a sword maiden inside the dimensional godstone? Did you guys really put the sword maiden inside the dimensional godstone? Guhan asked the sword wielder urgently. However, something unexpected happened. No matter what Guhan said, the sword wielder did not seem to hear him. It was as if Guhan had become a mute. However, Guhan was sure that his voice was very clear. After trying a few times, Guhan turned to Tomono Kakaze, who was floating beside him, and asked, Jina-chan, can you hear me? I can hear you. Tomono Kakaze nodded vigorously, indicating that she could hear Guhan's words. Therefore, it was obvious that only the sword wielder NPCs could not hear Guhan's voice. What did you eat this morning? Suddenly, Guhan asked such a strange question. Sesame seed cake with green onions? What's wrong? The sword wielder raised his head blankly, as if he did not understand why Guhan would ask such a question. It's nothing. It's just that the smell of green onions in your mouth is a little uncomfortable, Guhan explained calmly, and did not continue asking about the dimensional godstone. At that moment, Guhan realized that this was not a real world, but a dungeon built in the game. Moreover, this game dungeon seemed to have a rule to censor certain sensitive words. It was just like how the author of Chijian would clearly type in a novel, but the readers would see an asterisk instead. These words were censored. Similarly, the information about the sword maiden in this dungeon seemed to be censored in the same way. Therefore, the NPCs could not hear Guhan's question at all. Even if they could hear it, they would probably pretend that they did not hear it. Brother, you have already received the benefits. Shouldn't you go down and challenge the dungeon earlier? Don't waste time, okay? The sword wielder who gave a dimensional godstone to Guhan urged him with a pained expression. Okay. I don't want to stay here any longer, Guhan said faintly. He immediately jumped down from the entrance and strolled to the center of the bullring. Seeing that a swordsman had finally entered the arena, the rest of the people burst into cheers. They were not cheering for Ji Han's bravery, but for the five-colored sacred bull that was about to appear. They were very much looking forward to seeing the sword wielder get knocked into the air by the five-colored sacred bull and fall to the ground like a dog eating mud. When Guhan entered, the gate that had not been opened for a long time finally opened slowly, and a five-colored divine bull appeared in Guhan's field of vision. However, unlike what Guhan had guessed, the five-colored sacred bull wouldn't directly charge at Guhan. Instead, it swung its tail and walked out leisurely, looking like a five-colored sacred bull leisurely eating weeds in the field. TSK. The five-colored divine bull is still so carefree. The 5-colored sacred cow's leisurely reaction did not seem strange to the other sword-wielding spectators. On the contrary, it seemed like a normal thing to them. Yes, this is probably the mentality of a lonely expert, another sword-wielder said enviously. This also made Guhan roughly understand why the 5-colored sacred bull was so leisurely. It seemed that the 5-colored sacred bull had won so many times that it didn't care about the sword-wielding spectators at all, so it seemed especially leisurely. It was like if your opponent was a 3-year-old child, you couldn't just go up and punch him. Instead, he would leisurely walk around the 3-year-old child a few times and say a few words to tease the child. Then, he would use his hands to poke, pinch, pat the child's butt, and pull the child's poor little brother. He would use this kind of teasing attitude to deal with his opponent. In the eyes of the 5-colored sacred bull, Guhan was almost like a 3-year-old child. But then again, if the 5-colored sacred bull was so calm, why did it roar so angrily just now? Could it be that the 5-colored sacred bull simply wanted to tell the onlookers outside, "There's a loud bang in the sky, and I'll shine brightly? Come on. Hurry up. I'm in a hurry." Guhan waved his hand at the 5-colored sacred bull, as if the 5-colored sacred bull wasn't some powerful Yuan Ku, but a kitten or puppy at home. However, the 5-colored sacred bull ignored Guhan's greeting and continued to stand there leisurely, wagging its tail. It seemed that the 5-colored sacred bull was in a particularly good mood today. Since the 5-colored sacred bull didn't take the initiative to rush toward Guhan, then Guhan could only walk over by himself. When the other sword-wielding spectators saw this scene, they couldn't help but widen their eyes, thinking that this newbie was really a newborn calf that wasn't afraid of tigers. He was already lucky that the 5-colored sacred bull didn't take the initiative to attack him. Now, it actually took the initiative to approach the 5-colored sacred bull. Didn't it know that the 5-colored sacred bull could easily send him flying with its horn? Seeing that Guhan was gradually approaching it, the 5-colored sacred bull no longer put on a leisurely look, and the solid beef on its body began to bulge. Looking at the beautiful shape of the beef, if it was made into coriander beef, it would definitely taste good. Okay. The 5-colored sacred bull is finally going to attack. Amidst the cheers of the onlookers, the 5-colored sacred bull's hooves rubbed against the ground, and then it rushed toward Guhan at lightning speed. Seeing the 5-colored sacred bull rushing toward him, Guhan clenched his hands slightly. According to Guhan's original plan, he was going to find a flaw when the 5-colored sacred bull rushed over, directly put it on the ground, and then quickly put that damned sexy black stockings on it. Unexpectedly, when the 5-colored sacred bull approached Guhan, it suddenly stopped, and before Guhan could make a move, it took the initiative to lie on the ground, and stretched out its 4 hooves that were wrapped in 5 colors like lollipops. Then, it obediently pointed its 4 hooves at Guhan, as if telling Guhan to hurry up and put the stockings on it. Could this 5-colored sacred bull be secretly showing weakness, and then plan to hit me when I get close? Seeing this scene, Guhan couldn't help but make such a guess. But on second thought, this 5-colored sacred bull didn't seem to have such intelligence, and more importantly, even if it had such thoughts, it couldn't hurt Guhan at all. The moment its 4 hooves were ready to attack, Guhan could cripple its hooves. As the saying goes, those who are skilled are bold. Guhan pondered for a moment before calmly walking up. Then, he calmly put on 2 pairs of specially made sexy black stockings from the cow's hooves. In the process of putting on the stockings, he tried to make the leather of the bull's legs fit the stockings as much as possible, and at the same time, he carefully smoothed out some wrinkles on the stockings, so that the 4 stockings fit the 4 bull's legs in the most perfect posture. Someone once said that stockings were the most beautiful invention in the world. Even the ugliest woman could display a unique charm when she wore stockings. Previously, Guhan didn't quite agree with this sentence, but at this moment, when he saw the 5-colored sacred bull wearing black stockings on its legs, Guhan had to admit it. If the body of the 5-colored sacred bull was photoshopped and only the 4 stocking legs were looked at, it would undoubtedly be 4 very sexy stocking legs. It might even make some leg lovers have the urge to touch it. It was said that there was a kind of human in this world that was a zoophile. If such a person saw the 5-colored sacred bull wearing stockings, he would probably immediately want to have a go, even though it was a bull, stand up. After putting on the stockings, It was naturally time to put on the horn and the saddle. Guhan tried to order the five-colored sacred bull, but he didn't expect the five-colored sacred bull to really stand up very obediently, and it even stood up straight. Sigh, these were really 4 stocking legs that would make many girls feel ashamed. But they were growing on the body of a bull. Do you know me? Guhan directly put the saddle on the back of the five-colored sacred bull, and when he was about to put on the horn, Guhan finally couldn't help but ask the five-colored sacred bull, "Moo." The five-colored sacred bull let out a gentle cry. At the same time, it blinked its bull eyes at Guhan. It was clearly answering Guhan that it did know Guhan. This was very interesting. Guhan had never encountered the five-colored sacred bull in real life. Coincidentally, the only time Guhan encountered the five-colored sacred bull was in a dungeon. That was the Rise from the Ground dungeon that Guhan had previously completed. In that dungeon, Guhan had indeed slaughtered a bull of the five-colored sacred bull. Could it be that this five-colored sacred bull was actually the five-colored sacred bull from that dungeon? Logically speaking, this was impossible. How could the five-colored sacred bull appear in 2 dungeons at the same time? Moreover, the five-colored sacred bull had already died under Guhan's sword and became a delicacy for the construction workers in Yuzhang City. How could it appear in the 12 Heavenly Palaces dungeon again? However, after the five-colored sacred bull appeared, all kinds of special reactions told Guhan that it did indeed recognize Guhan, and it was very likely that it was the five-colored sacred bull. If you are the five-colored sacred bull that I killed, then please blink your eyes 3 times. Guhan decided to confirm with the five-colored sacred bull. If the five-colored sacred bull could really understand him, then it would definitely be able to answer his question. Moo! Another bull's cry rang out, and the five-colored divine bull began to blink its eyes. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. The five-colored divine bull's third blink was only halfway through when it suddenly blinked twice at an extremely fast speed. Then, it completely left Guhan and walked back to the pen while wagging its tail. After the five-colored sacred bull re-entered the pen, it actually took the initiative to bite the bolt of the pen and close the pen. It was as natural as closing the door at home. I might have entered a fake dungeon, Guhan said as he licked his lips. We might have seen a fake five-colored sacred bull. This was what the other onlookers said in unison. Chapter 963. This isn't fair. This five-colored sacred bull must be sick. Seeing that Guhan had successfully completed the task, a sword-bearer said loudly with great dissatisfaction. This sword-bearer was the one who had just been extorted by Guhan of a dimensional spiritual stone. As the saying goes, if you spend money, you have to listen to the sound of it. The reason why this sword-bearer was willing to give Guhan a dimensional spiritual stone was that he felt that Guhan was helping him solve the problem. Only when Guhan was sent flying by the bull's horns would the price he paid be worth it. Therefore, this sword-bearer was looking forward to seeing the scene of Guhan being sent flying. However, he never expected that this five-colored sacred bull was a sick one. It was as obedient as a kitten or puppy. In less than a minute, Guhan successfully completed the challenge. This made the sword-bearer regret it. This opportunity should have been his. If he had been more courageous and directly entered the bullring, then he would have easily completed the task. But in the end, not only did he not complete the task, but he also lost a dimensional spiritual stone. No matter how he thought about it, it was a losing deal. Therefore, when he saw that Guhan had completed the task and was about to leave, he immediately shouted angrily. However, his anger was useless. Ji-Yuhan didn't pay attention to him at all. Instead, he left the bullfighting arena's exit in a carefree manner. From beginning to end, he didn't even look at the sword-bearer. This silent ridicule made the sword-bearer even angrier. However, no matter how angry he was, the challenge still had to continue. After Guhan left the bullring, the next challenge was about to begin. Moo! The familiar earth-shattering sound came from the bullpen again. This made the waiting sword-bearers look at each other. Could it be that the next one to appear was the five-colored sacred bull? Logically speaking, it shouldn't be like this. In the past, the five-colored sacred bull would go back and rest for a few days after a battle. There were very few records of it appearing consecutively. However, since it was rare, it meant that there had indeed been records of it appearing consecutively. It was just that the frequency was too low. Okay. Leave it to me. The eyes of the swordsman who had just scolded Guhan lit up. Since the 5-colored sacred cow was sick today, didn't that mean his chance had come? Would he be able to pass through Bullfighting Palace as easily as that person? Thinking of this, the swordsman immediately became excited. He jumped into the bullring and looked at the bullpen in high spirits. He was ready to learn from Guhan and easily complete the challenge. Well, the result didn't need to be mentioned. According to the recollections of the person involved, the 5-colored sacred bull that appeared the second time seemed to be particularly violent. Before the unlucky swordsman could react, the 5-colored sacred bull's horn had struck his lower body. After that, there was no more news about this unlucky swordsman. After Bullfighting Palace was Baihu Palace. If Mouse Palace tested the swordsman's movement skills, Bullfighting Palace tested the swordsman's ability to seize opportunities and courage, then Baihu Palace tested the swordsman's ability to get rid of weeds. Baihu Palace's test was very simple. It was to give the swordsman an irregular inverted triangle of black grass that was around 5 square meters. The swordsman needed to use 3 swords to chop all the black grass. It sounded very simple, but in fact, the black grass was not really wild grass. Instead, it was all steel bars as thick as a child's arm. What the swordsman needed to do was to cut all the steel bars in half. Was this difficult or not? It could be said that it wasn't. Even if a famed sword-level swordsman didn't have any sword skills, he could still use the sharp sword in his hand to chop a steel bar. As long as he was a famed sword-level swordsman, he could do it. However, this was very difficult because according to Baihu Palace's requirement, the swordsman had to chop all the steel bars at the root within 3 swords without using sword essence. First, the area was around 5 square meters, so one sword sweep obviously couldn't cover the entire area of the grass. At the same time, the steel bars were densely packed like real grass. There were around 100 steel bars that popped out. As the saying went, an arrow at the end of its flight couldn't wear a cape. The first few steel bars might be relatively easy with one sword sweep, but when it came to the 5th and 6th steel bars, the swordsman's sword force would be at the end of its flight. It would be very difficult to chop another steel bar. More importantly, there couldn't be any pause in the entire process. Even if there was an extremely short pause of a few milliseconds, Baihu Palace would judge it as the end of the sword. For example, there was a challenger who was separated from Jiyu Han by a patch of grass. He first did some warm-up exercises such as sit-ups and push-ups to warm up the muscles in his body. Then, he did it like an old monk meditating for 7 to 8 minutes to concentrate his spirit. Finally, when his mind and spirit were united to the extreme, he suddenly pulled out his sword lady and performed the best sword strike of his life. His slash was quite smooth at first, but when he slashed the 10th steel bar, Jiyu Han realized that his opponent had run out of strength. When the 13th steel bar was slashed, Jiyu Han's slash hit the 14th steel bar, and he subconsciously paused for a moment. A red light immediately lit up around him, indicating that his slash had ended. This was already his 3rd slash. The first 2 slashes had severed 18 and 17 steel bars respectively. Adding the 14 steel bars now, it was less than half of the total number of steel bars. The dense forest of steel bars was still growing on the ground. It was obvious that the swordbearer had failed the test. Why? Why do you have to set such an insane test? This isn't something that humans can do. The swordsman had probably failed many times. When he failed again, he couldn't help but break down. He fell to the ground and cried like a child. Because you are only using your own power. You are not using your sword lady's power. A hoarse and cold voice rang in the swordsman's ears. Don't misunderstand, Guhan wasn't interested in teaching these NPCs how to use their own power. The person who spoke now wasn't Guhan, but the future sword Celestial Scarlet, whom Guhan had met once before. Right now, Scarlet Sword Celestial Scarlet's name. But the swordsman didn't have a sword name, so we should just call her Scarlet. If I can't use my sword lady's power, how can I use my sword lady's power? The swordsman with tears on his face retorted. You said that you can't use your sword lady's power if you don't use your sword lady's power? That's because you haven't discovered the true power of your sword lady. Captivating Red squatted down beside the swordsman, which happened to be right next to Guhan. Just now, I saw you meditating on the ground for a few minutes. Were you trying to gather your thoughts through meditation? From there, you can unleash your most condensed power, Captivating Red suddenly said. Not bad. Is there a problem? The sword wielder narrowed his red eyes and asked. Of course it's not wrong. However, you've only condensed your own power. Although this sword strike was unleashed through the Sword Maiden, it's actually still using your own power. This is a big mistake. You should have integrated your own power into the Sword Maiden, and then slashed out this sword together with your own Sword Maiden. That way, you would have been successful in every endeavor. After saying this, Captivating Red suddenly pulled out her Sword Maiden and pressed the blade against her forehead. It was as if she was fusing something with the blade. Her aura and the sword's aura fused together, continuously rising and rising. Finally, when this aura reached its peak, Captivating Red slashed out without hesitation. In the blink of an eye, Captivating Red's Sword Maiden returned to its sheath. A gentle breeze blew past, and the rebar grass in front of her fell to the ground like chopsticks on a table. Half of the rebar grass was swept away in an instant, revealing the pinkish, flesh-colored soil underneath. Then, Captivating Red repeated the sword technique she had just used, and cut off the other half of the rebar grass. However, because of the shape of the grass, Captivating Red couldn't cut off half of the rebar grass like before. She could only cut off the remaining rebar grass twice. However, this didn't affect anything. Captivating Red had already reached the standard required by Baihu Palace. She cleared off the rebar grass in 3 strikes, and not a single vertical rebar remained. Amazing. The swordsman stared at Captivating Red with eyes full of admiration and envy. He sincerely hoped that Captivating Red could become his master and learn such a sword technique. I'm not fit to be someone else's master. I'm here to find my master. Captivating Red spoke plainly to the swordsman. Then what kind of person is fit to be your master? The swordsman asked curiously. Do you even need to ask? Captivating Red rolled her eyes at the swordsman. Of course it's the creator of the 12 skyscraping palaces, the powerful fleeting Gendi. Only someone like him is fit to be my master. I see. The swordsman bowed respectfully to Captivating Red, and left the Baihu Palace happily. He made up his mind that he would continue to challenge the Baihu Palace and try to master the swordsmanship that Captivating Red spoke of. What? Do you want to be my disciple as well? Captivating Red turned to look at Guhan after sending off the swordsman. Captivating Red had long since noticed that the man was staring at her. He was obviously a man who admired her swordsmanship and wanted to be her disciple. Chapter 964. Guhan didn't say anything and just looked at the rebar grass in front of him. Yang Hong then realized that the rebar grass in front of the sword wielder had already been shaved off. What was curious was that the land under the steel forest was pink with a hint of yellow. There was a slight bulge in the middle of the triangular land that looked like a small steamed bun. Oh, you are quite capable, Yang Hong muttered and then shifted her attention away from Guhan. She turned to look at the rebar grass that had been shaved off and fell into deep thought. She couldn't help but mutter to herself, strange, the mouse palace is full of mice, the bullfighting palace is full of cows, but why isn't there a single tiger in the Baihu Palace? You don't have hair on your mouth, so you aren't reliable. Guhan leisurely walked to Yang Hong's side and said, You don't have hair on your mouth, so you aren't reliable? What does that mean? Explain it to me. Yang Hong was puzzled for a while. Then, she hurriedly chased after Jiyu Han and kept asking him what he meant by his words. You pervert. So disgusting. Yang Hong didn't understand, but the little lowly Tomono Kakaze who was floating beside Guhan understood. Her skin instantly turned red and she looked at Guhan with disgust. I didn't design this. Go find that old guy Kunzu. Guhan didn't look ashamed at all. This wasn't Guhan's fault anyway. But from this point, it could be seen that Kunzu wasn't as wise, powerful, sanctimonious, and flawless as the rumors said. From the perverted tests he gave to the bullfighting palace and the Baihu palace, our Lord Kanzu was a real flirtatious man. After going through the first 3 palaces, Guhan was filled with curiosity about the following tests. He didn't know what kind of strange test Kanzu would come up with. I believe everyone understood after seeing this. From the names of Mouse Palace, Bullfighting Palace, and Baihu Palace, it was obvious that the 12 skyscraping palaces were named according to the order of the 12 zodiac animals. Naturally, the 4th palace was a test named after a rabbit, and the 4th palace was called the Red Rabbit Palace. This was an interesting name, because although the Scarlet Rabbit had the word rabbit in it, it was not a rabbit at all, but a precious horse. Could it be that the tests in the Red Rabbit Temple were actually related to horses? With this thought in mind, Guhan and Captivating Red, who was following behind Guhan, chattering endlessly about what hairless lips and incompetent work meant, walked into the Red Rabbit Palace. In the end, not only were there no rabbits in the Red Rabbit Palace, but there were also no horses. The entire palace was isolated by pieces of red cloth. Standing at the entrance, Guhan and Captivating Red couldn't see what kind of test was in the Red Rabbit Palace. However, Guhan was sure of one thing, and that was that the test was definitely extremely painful. Because of the red cloth, Guhan and Captivating Red could clearly hear painful howls from the depths of the palace. It was the sound of a human, a sound that could only be made when a person was in extreme pain, suppression, and madness. Just the crazy trembling of the syllables allowed Guhan and Captivating Red to understand what kind of pain and torture the owner of the voice was going through. What exactly is the Red Rabbit Palace testing? Guhan didn't understand, but he wasn't afraid. He acted as usual. However, Captivating Red, who was beside Guhan, was different. From her trembling skin, Guhan could clearly see how scared and fearful she was. Clearly, Captivating Red knew what the test in the Red Rabbit Palace was all about. Although Guhan really wanted to ask Captivating Red what the test in the Red Rabbit Palace was, when he thought of how indifferent he was to her earlier, Captivating Red probably wouldn't tell Guhan the secret of the Red Rabbit Palace. However, it didn't matter. No matter what the test was, Guhan could only walk forward. Even a woman like Captivating Red had the courage to face such a test, let alone a man like Guhan who thought highly of himself. Contestant, please follow me. A human attendant appeared in front of Guhan and spoke to Guhan as he flipped open layers of red cloth. This was the first time Guhan had seen another human in the 12 skyscraping palaces. From the way the attendant walked, it was obvious that he was just an ordinary human. He was most likely someone who worked in the 12 skyscraping palaces for a long time. Under the attendant's guidance, Guhan passed through layers of red cloth and finally stopped in a room that was surrounded by red cloth. Guhan looked around the room and noticed that there was a wooden wardrobe on each side of the room. In the middle of the room, there were 2 cylindrical glass cabinets made of transparent glass that were more than 2 meters tall. There was a round hole on the top of the glass cabinets. The 2 glass cylinders were connected by a few glass plates. The overall design looked like a pair of binoculars. Contestant, please remove your clothes and enter the cupboard naked. Adjust the lift at the bottom so that your neck can be exposed from the cabinet and you can begin the test, the attendant said to Guhan. Although Guhan did not know what the attendant was up to, he did not hesitate to remove his clothes and put them into the cabinet along with all his sword maidens. Then, Guhan entered the glass cabinet according to the attendant's instructions and stuck his head out of the round hole at the top. This way, Guhan was standing in a bucket of binoculars. There's a bucket here. Could it be that there's another person locked inside like me? As soon as Guhan thought of this, the question was confirmed. This was because Yang Hong was immediately led into the room that Guhan was in by the attendant. Yang Hong, who entered the room, suddenly saw Guhan's naked body through the transparent glass. She instantly let out a scream and covered her eyes as she scolded the attendant. Why did you bring me here? Don't you know that men and women are different? Do I still want to get married? What's going on? Why did you bring a woman in? The attendant who led Guhan in asked the other attendant in confusion. I had no choice. The attendant shrugged. I was going to wait for another woman to come in and arrange for them to be together. But just now, old Lee from Baihu Palace told me that there's no woman in the entire Baihu Palace. Maybe I won't be able to find a pair for this woman even after waiting for 7 to 8 hours. So, I could only bring her in. Then, the attendant patted Yang Hong's shoulder. Didn't I tell you that there's a special situation? Also, you told me that you don't mind. If you can't accept the test of a man and a woman, then you can wait at the door. When the next woman appears, I'll arrange for the two of you to take the test. Do I have to wait for 7 to 8 hours? Yang Hong bit her lips. She couldn't help but recall the time when she queued in Bullfighting Palace for more than 10 hours. She immediately made a decision. It's fine, I can accept the test. Then there's no problem. The attendant shrugged. Just like this man. Take off your clothes and get in. You can adjust your height by using the lift at the bottom. Can I wear the underwear? Yang Hong asked hesitantly. Of course not. The attendant answered without hesitation. This is a rule set by Sword Emperor Liu Nian. You have to be naked when taking the Scarlet Rabbit Palace's test. You cannot have anything on you. Otherwise, you will automatically fail the test. But that's for 2 women. I'm with a man right now. Yang Hong raised her voice. Then wait at the door. There are only 2 ways to go back. Do as you see fit. The attendant flung his sleeves angrily and left the room with the other attendant. She pulled the other waiter out of the room, leaving only Yang Hong and Ji Yu Han in the awkward room. Take off your clothes. If you don't get in within 3 minutes, I'll consider it as a failure. The waiter's annoying voice came from outside the red cloth. Yang Hong had no choice but to place her trembling hands on her collar. At the same time, she glared fiercely at Ji Yu Han and threatened, "Don't look at me." Ji Yu Han couldn't be bothered with this woman. He just stared at Yang Hong with his eyes wide open. Pervert. Yang Hong wailed, but there was no better way. She could only bite the bullet and take off her clothes bit by bit. Yang Hong hesitated when it came to taking off her underwear. She struggled for a long time before she unbuttoned it and took off the thin lace triangle. In the end, Yang Hong covered her upper body with one hand and her lower body with the other, and crawled into the cylinder opposite of Gu Han. Of course, Yang Hong did not dare to face Gu Han directly. She could only throw a beautiful curve of her back in front of Gu Han. The 2 contestants inside, have you both entered the round cabinet? The attendant's annoying voice came from outside. Gu Han and Yang Hong responded one after another. However, Gu Han's voice was calm and peaceful, while Yang Hong's voice was full of shame and fear. What surprised Gu Han was that the fear in her voice was far greater than the shame. This meant that Captivating Crimson cared more about the test she was about to face than the shame of being naked. 20 minutes. The attendant continued, in the next 20 minutes, you must stay awake at all times. You must not pass out. At the same time, you are not allowed to touch any part of your body. Not even the slightest bit of friction is allowed. If you do, you will be considered a failure. At the same time, you are not allowed to harm any life that appears in the round cabinet. If you kill any life, you will also be considered a failure. What does that mean? What does it mean that I am not allowed to harm the life that appears in the round cabinet? Could it be that there will be more? Ji Yu Han suddenly had a bad premonition. Chapter 965. Just as Gu Han seemed to have grasped onto something, the cabinet suddenly changed. 4 mechanical tentacles suddenly extended from the bottom of the cabinet, grabbing towards Gu Han's ankles and wrists. Although these mechanical tentacles moved very quickly, if Gu Han wanted to dodge, the 4 tentacles wouldn't be able to catch him. However, Ji Yu Han didn't resist. Instead, he allowed the mechanical tentacles to grab him. Ji Yu Han noticed that Captivating Red, who was in the other cylinder, didn't show any signs of panic when she saw the mechanical tentacles. Instead, she allowed them to grab her. Clearly, this was a normal procedure in the upcoming test. However, what Gu Han and Captivating Hong didn't expect was that after the mechanical tentacles grabbed her, they suddenly pulled her body 180 degrees. Captivating Hong, who was originally facing away from Gu Han, was now facing Gu Han. Ah! Captivating Hong screamed. She instinctively tried to cover her private parts with her hands. Helpless, Guhan could only remind her, "Don't cover yourself." "Ah, you pervert, what are you doing?" Captivating Hong shouted. She thought that the other party was intoxicated with her body. "Don't forget, if you touch your own body, you'll fail the test." Guhan could only point it out. He wasn't interested in captivating Hong's body. He just couldn't bear to see this woman, who was going to suffer great pain in the future, suffer another sudden failure here. Captivating Hong didn't say anything. She slowly retracted her hands that were about to cover her chest. Then, the 4 tentacles suddenly pulled inwards, directly pulling Guhan and captivating Hong's limbs into a large shape. Their hands and feet couldn't move at all. Like this, all the private parts of their bodies were completely exposed. Even their 2 private parts were exposed. Even the faintest bit of dew in the forest could be seen. "It's over. I really can't get married this time," Yang Hong muttered in despair with a sad face, causing Guhan to sink into deep thought. Although the history of this dungeon was vastly different from the recorded history, the Scarlet Sword Immortal's character was as accurate as ever. The Sword Immortal Scarlet Sword Immortal had also wanted to marry herself off, which was why all of the subsequent tragic events had occurred, thereby cementing the tragedy of her life. Even if she was a sword immortal, she would still end up with a broken body and 1,000 years of regret. What will happen next? In order to alleviate Captivating Red's embarrassment, Guhan took the initiative to ask. "Something very good will happen. I just hope that you can hold on for a minute." As soon as Captivating Hong's stiff voice fell, the round hole at the top of the round cabinet suddenly began to shrink inwards. Finally, it was firmly stuck on Guhan's neck, leaving not a single gap between the two. At the same time, a hole suddenly appeared at the bottom of the round cabinet. Then, thick black smoke flew out of the hole, instantly filling the entire glass cabinet. It also completely covered Guhan and Captivating Hong's bodies, no longer revealing a trace of their bodies. Logically speaking, when Captivating Hong found that her body was covered, she should be happy, but her face showed endless fear. This was because the black smoke that filled the entire glass cabinet was not smoke, but densely packed black mosquitoes. There were more than 10,000 of these mosquitoes. Otherwise, they would not have been able to cover such a large glass cabinet so tightly, turning a transparent glass cabinet into a glass cabinet that looked like it was filled with ink. So what were these mosquitoes for? The answer was very simple. Of course, mosquitoes were used to bite people. These black mosquitoes seemed to have been hungry for a long time. When 2 naked bodies filled with fresh blood were placed in front of these mosquitoes, there was no reason for them not to bite. But at first, Guhan did not care about these mosquitoes. The stinger of a mosquito might be able to pierce through the skin of a normal person, but it definitely could not pierce through the skin of a famed sword wielder. The skin of a famed sword wielder had been strengthened by the Sword Lady. Their skin was like a layer of iron, so how could the stinger of a mosquito pierce through the skin of a famed sword wielder? But soon, Guhan realized that he was very wrong. This was because Guhan clearly felt that there were countless small stingers easily piercing into his skin and absorbing his blood. When the stingers were pulled out, they left a red and swollen bump on his skin. "Oh no! I missed a step, and these mosquitoes are actually all Yuenko." Only then did Guhan realize that these mosquitoes were the same as the bulls in the bullfighting palace. They were all Yuan-ku, so their stingers could easily pierce through his skin. Soon, Guhan felt his body being bitten by countless small bumps. Then, an indescribable itch instantly spread to every part of his body. This itch was more than 10 times the itch of an ordinary mosquito bite. Guhan almost subconsciously stretched out his hands, wanting to scratch the most itchy parts of his body. But after 0.1 seconds, Guhan realized that he couldn't scratch the itch. Once his hands touched his body, the entire test would be declared a failure. At this moment, Ji Yuhan finally understood what the test was. It was to let the mosquito bite you, causing your body to feel an intense itch that made you want to scratch it. And what the contestant needed to do was to endure this itch, allow it to torture you, and use your own will to control your body not to scratch it. This was a test of the swordsman's willpower and control over his own body. It sounded a bit ridiculous, But Guhan had to admit that this was indeed a very vicious and effective test. Let me ask all of you, when your body is itchy because of a mosquito bite, can you resist the temptation to scratch yourself and not scratch yourself? If you can endure 1 mosquito bite, can you endure 10 mosquito bites? And when the number of mosquito bites becomes 100 or even 1,000, can you imagine how painful it is? Even with Guhan's willpower, he couldn't help but moan. His body was so itchy that he really wanted to scratch his skin to suppress the itch. But in fact, Guhan couldn't even clench his fists at this time, because once he clenched his fists, it also meant that he was touching himself. Guhan could only spread his palms wide and let out moans from his throat to relieve the itch. But how much of the itch could be relieved by sound? Almost in an instant, countless beads of sweat appeared on the surface of Guhan's body. His body temperature also rose by more than 10 degrees in an instant, reaching a terrifying 50 degrees. A normal person would have been burned alive in this situation. Only the sword-bearer could withstand this temperature. Compared to Ji Yuhan's low and somewhat suppressed moans, Captivating Red's moans suddenly uncontrollably began to scream crazily. The pleasant female voice coupled with the moans suddenly made Ji Yuhan feel as if he had returned to the time when he was making love with Chijian. Chijian was also moaning with desire just like Captivating Red in front of him. But compared to Chijian, Captivating Hong's moans were louder and more wanton. At the same time, just like her name, Captivating Red's face turned bright red. Coupled with the ticklish moans coming from the depths of her heart, Ji Yuhan couldn't help but feel an itch in his heart. Then, his little brother started to change very cooperatively. But unexpectedly, when Guhan's little brother started to change, those black characters seemed to have discovered a new continent. They all stabbed their tail needles into this new and undeveloped land. Then, without saying anything more, Guhan fully experienced the feeling of being itchy on top of an itch. What kind of mosquitoes are these? Why are they so powerful? I feel that they are more than 10 times itchier than ordinary mosquitoes, Guhan asked Captivating Hong on the other side. Captivating Hong didn't answer Guhan's question. She was still moaning by herself. I suggest you answer my question, Guhan said faintly. Don't you feel that this kind of sound is more shameful? Captivating Hong's voice stopped abruptly. After a moment of silence, she replied with difficulty, these are Wen Daoist's blood-black mosquitoes. Each of them is a mouse-level Yuan Ku. They are 20 times itchier than ordinary mosquitoes. So they are Wen Daoist's mosquitoes. Information about Wen Daoist immediately appeared in Guhan's mind. This was a very vicious Yuan Ku that appeared in this world in the early period of the apocalypse. This Wen Daoist's original body was a blood-black mosquito, so he raised tens of millions of children and grandchildren in his body. These tens of millions of blood-black mosquitoes needed to suck the blood of 1,000 humans to keep themselves alive. Therefore, these blood-black mosquitoes became one of the most terrifying killers of humanity. Every day, thousands of humans were sucked dry into a mummy, becoming nourishment for these blood-black mosquitoes. In order to eradicate this vicious Yuenko, the sword ancestor, who was only at the spirit sword rank, found the fallen rank Yuenko, Wen Daoist. After a great battle, the sword ancestor killed this sinful guy who was at a higher level than him, eliminating a great threat for the human race. The blood-black mosquitoes were completely extinct. From then on, there was no record of blood-black mosquitoes in the human world. Unexpectedly, although Wen Daoist died, his children and grandchildren were raised by Kunzu, and now they became the murderers who tortured Guhan and Captivating Hong. Chapter 966. Every inch of Guhan's body was filled with desire, and every cell on his skin was calling out to Guhan. These damned mosquitoes seemed to be able to burrow into Guhan's body through his skin, then fly up along the nerves in his body step by step, and finally gather in Guhan's brain. Ji Yuhan only felt that his mind had been filled with mosquitoes, as though he had fallen into an endless hell. He wished he could peel off his skin and hollow out his brain in order to alleviate this endless itch. What was even more frightening was that his hands and feet had been tied up. A normal person only needed to scratch or even caress to relieve the itch, but Guhan had no way to deal with it. He could only endure this huge torture. When the itch reached its limit, Guhan could not help but want to scratch himself. However, when he wanted to scratch himself, he found that his limbs had been firmly locked by mechanical tentacles, and it was impossible for him to touch other parts of his body. If he could not scratch himself, then a normal person could only hope that he would faint. As long as he fainted, he would not have to endure such intense itch. In reality, the human body had a self-protection mechanism. When faced with mental pain that could not be endured, the human body would automatically faint, so that it would not collapse from the torture. At this moment, Guhan was already in a daze. If he followed his instincts, Guhan should be able to easily fall asleep. However, at the same time, Guhan was very clear that he must not fall asleep. Because once he fainted, this test would be declared over, and all the tickling he had endured before would be meaningless. However, this torture was still within the range of Guhan's endurance. After all, Guhan was a fierce person who could leave deep wounds on 3 sword ladies in one night. The pain caused by the sword ladies was actually comparable to the pain caused by the mosquitoes. Guhan gritted his teeth and was able to endure it. However, it was clear that Yang Hong's side was unable to endure it. The woman's voice could pass through 3 or 4 layers of walls, but now, it was only as small as a fly. At the same time, her eyes were so squinted that she could not open them, and it was obvious that she was about to faint. Enough. It's not like she can make it to the 12 palaces, so I'll just let her stay here and suffer less, Guhan thought. He didn't want to wake Yang Hong up. However, he did not expect that after more than 10 seconds, the scream that sounded like a pig being slaughtered once again exploded in Ji Yuhan's ears. Get out! Get out! Get out of here! You are not allowed to come in. Yang Hong, who was still in a semi-conscious state, suddenly began to scream as if her mental power had exploded. She kept shouting in horror, "Get out! Don't come in! Enough! Don't you think it's a little too late to call me out? Besides, I definitely won't go out." Guhan instinctively thought that Yang Hong was calling him out. This made Guhan, who was already in a bad mood after being bitten by mosquitoes, even more unhappy. "No! I'm not asking you to get out." Yang Hong looked like she was about to cry. "I'm asking the mosquitoes to get out. The hole under our feet that the mosquitoes flew in has been closed again. Even if the mosquitoes want to leave this glass cabinet, they can't do it. What's the point of screaming like that?" Guhan couldn't help but roll his eyes at Yang Hong. Wasn't this person a little too naive? It wasn't even 20 minutes yet. How could the mosquitoes be recalled? "I'm not asking the mosquitoes to leave this cabinet. I'm saying. Yang Hong suddenly stopped, unable to say what she wanted to say for a long time. Instead, her whole face turned red, and a shy expression appeared on her face. Wait. This woman can't mean that. Guhan suddenly thought of a possibility. Did the mosquitoes crawl into the cabinet? Guhan asked. Yang Hong didn't say anything, but her silence only confirmed Guhan's question. Obviously, the deeper part of her body had been invaded by the mosquitoes. What should I do? Anyway, the matter had already been guessed by Ji Yuhan, so Yin Hong didn't care about the question of embarrassment. She desperately asked Ji Yuhan, "Those damn mosquitoes bit me a few times inside. I'm now. How was Yang Hong now?" Yang Hong not only itched on the outside, but also on the inside of her body. The skin there was more delicate than the skin outside, so the itch was naturally more than 10 times stronger than the skin outside. Yang Hong only felt that there was a raging flame burning inside her body, and this flame was constantly roasting the inside of her body, roasting out the moisture in her body bit by bit, and then dripping outside, forming a small pool of water that was neither too big nor too small. "Bear with it," Guhan said lightly. Yang Hong was so painful that she was about to cry. "Is there no other better way? Actually, you should be happy." Guhan licked his dry lips. "This way, you won't pass out." Thanks to Yang Hong, Guhan felt that his attention and imagination had been completely diverted to another place, and Guhan probably wouldn't pass out. After the mosquito invasion, both Guhan and Yang Hong clearly felt that time was much better than before. Although this brought Yang Hong a great sense of shame, this sense of shame collided with the huge itch, which made Yang Hong feel that time was not so difficult to bear. This also made Yang Hong feel a little glad about such a shameful thing, and this little joy made Yang Hong feel even more ashamed. If the rest of the time passed like this, Yang Hong felt that she could continue to hold on until all the time was over. But about 10 minutes after the test began, an unforeseen event happened. In an instant, the 4 mechanical tentacles that bound Guhan's hands and feet loosened, then quickly returned to the bottom of the glass cabinet, and freedom was returned to Guhan. Logically speaking, this should be a good thing. After all, no one would want their hands and feet to be tied up. But in fact, when Guhan regained his freedom, Guhan's heart skipped a beat. He knew that a more terrifying test was coming. The moment Guhan fell on the glass cabinet, his hands were freed, and he instinctively wanted to scratch his itchy chest, but before he could move, his hands were stopped by Guhan, because Guhan knew that he could not do that. Previously, both Guhan and Yang Hong's hands and feet were bound by the mechanical tentacles. Although this greatly restricted Guhan's and Yang Hong's freedom, it also gave Guhan and Yang Hong a benefit. That was, Guhan and Yang Hong could not move their hands and feet freely. Even if they wanted to scratch themselves, it was impossible. On the contrary, they could constantly struggle with their hands and feet to offset part of the itch. Compared to the benefits they gained, losing a bit of meaningless freedom was not a big deal. But when freedom returned to Guhan's hands, Guhan deeply realized how wonderful those mechanical tentacles were. Previously, because he was bound by the mechanical tentacles, he was destined to be unable to use his hands, so Guhan did not think about scratching himself. But once he regained his freedom, when the Gu Han could scratch his itch, this problem would become even more serious. When one's body itched unbearably, when one knew that a gentle scratch could relieve the great pain, could one still resist the urge to scratch himself? As long as he scratched himself gently, all the itchiness would be suppressed, and he would obtain a great sense of satisfaction. He would feel as if he was floating in the air. When his limbs were bound, this temptation was not obvious enough, but once his limbs were freed, the temptation to scratch himself instantly slapped at Guhan like a turbulent wave. However, Guhan's mind was very clear. The attendant from Red Rabbit Palace had said it clearly. He would not allow himself to take the initiative to touch any part of his body. Once he touched any part of his body, the challenge would immediately be declared a failure, and all his previous efforts would come to an end. Therefore, at this moment, Guhan understood that freeing his hands and feet was not a good thing. Instead, it was an even greater test. Previously, Guhan only had to endure the torture of the itch, but now, Guhan had to endure the test of the desire to scratch himself from the depths of his heart. This was equivalent to enduring 2 tests at the same time. One came from the outside world, and the other came from his heart. It was obvious that the desire that came from the depths of his heart was harder to endure than the torture from the outside world. This was a common principle since ancient times. Humans were very strange creatures. Their hands were clearly under their control, but most of the time, their hands were not under their control at all. Since ancient times, it was very difficult for humans to use their rationality to control their hands. Most of the time, it was their own desires that controlled them. It was just like how you knew that drug addiction and gambling would ruin your family, but you would still throw yourself into it without a care for your own safety. If you wanted to quit drugs, you had to go to a forced detoxification center. If you wanted to study well, you had to be taught by your parents. You had to force yourself to finish your winter vacation homework in the last few days of the winter vacation. Humans always clamored for absolute freedom, but when absolute freedom was given to everyone, it would probably be the end of the world. The Red Rabbit Palace's test was no longer just a test of one's ability to endure torture. It was a test of one's ability to control one's nature. This was a test that even a so-called sage would find difficult to endure. No wonder countless people are stuck at the Red Rabbit Palace, unable to pass. I'm afraid even sage Confucius wouldn't be able to resist this temptation, Guhan thought as he endured the double test. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.